How's it working right now?
Check 1, 2. Check 1.
Order à l'autre. The Public Order Emergency Commission is now in session. La commission sur l'état d'urgence est maintenant ouverte.
Good morning, bonjour. Okay, Commission Council, we're ready to go.
Alors, Antoine Chaudry pour la commission. Le prochain témoin, c'est le ministre Marco Mendeccino. Bonjour. Ministre Mendeccino, voulez-vous jurer sur un document religieux? S'il vous plaît. Bible, le Coran ou la Torah? La Bible. Votre nom? Marco Mendeccino. M-A-R-C-O. M-E-N-D-I-C-I-N-O. Jurez-vous que le témoignage que vous allez rendre aujourd'hui sera la vérité, toute la vérité et rien d'autre que la vérité, que Dieu vous soit en aide? Je le jure. Alors,
So we'll just start with a little housekeeping, which is the entry of your witness summary. You'll recall sitting for an interview with Commission Counsel on September 5th of this year.
Yes.
And after that interview, Commission Counsel prepared a summary of the interview. Have you seen and reviewed that summary?
I have,
Okay.
yes.
And can you confirm that it's accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Okay. For the record, Mr. Clerk, that's WTS 5054. No need to pull it up. So, Mr. Mendeccino, I understand you were appointed Minister of Public Safety in October 2021. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And can you briefly outline, well, first of all, your background before that, your background in politics, and what you did before that?
I was first elected in 2015 and have been serving as the Member of Parliament for Eglinton Lawrence, which is a constituency in North Toronto. Have been re-elected twice, both in 2019 and in 2021. And prior to getting into politics, I was a practicing lawyer in Ontario, where I served for about a decade as a federal prosecutor, and then subsequently as a private practitioner, as well as counsel at the Law Society of Ontario.
Okay. So can you briefly outline, and I really do mean briefly, we have a lot to get through in these 2 and a bit hours, so we'll do our best to do so. Your responsibilities as Minister of Public Safety.
Well, this is a position where the job description is in the title. So my paramount responsibility is to ensure that we maintain public safety. And the only way that you can do that is to ensure that laws are upheld. But beyond that, and specifically in the context of this inquiry and in response to the events of last winter, I had a number of responsibilities, including receiving information and sharing information from law enforcement to colleagues within the federal government, making sure that we were staying in touch and engaging with different levels of government, both provincially and municipally, making sure that we gave advice to the government with regards to the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act and then subsequently to revoke the Emergencies Act, being a communicator on behalf of the government to Canadians to keep them apprised of the situation last winter. And a number of other roles, but those are the core ones.
Okay, and we're going to explore a lot of the details of what you just outlined today. So we'll start with the time period before the convoy arrived in Ottawa. So, Mr. Clerk, can I ask you to pull up ssm.nsc.can 401790? So, Mr. Mendeccino, to situate you, this is just on January 26th, I believe. Oh, I'm sorry, if you just scroll down a little bit. You had asked Commissioner Lucky, I believe, to brief you on the convoy. Do you recall that?
I do recall that. By the end of January, there were reports about a massive protest that was mobilizing from across the country. And so to be sure that we were, again, kept aware of how police were going to respond to that protest, we asked for briefings.
Okay. And the next document I'll ask you to pull up, Mr. Clerk, is pb.nsc.can 50992. So these, to situate you again, as the document's being pulled up, Minister, are talking points for the briefing on January 26th. I believe they're Commissioner Lucky's talking points. So they're not yours, but I'm going to take you through them, and you can confirm to us whether this was the sort of information that was being provided to you that day. So 26th, before the convoy arrives. We scroll down, Mr. Clerk, to where you see the goal of, there we go. So the goal of the nationwide protest is to disrupt traffic flow and general business of government in the hope that the Canadian government will lift all COVID-19 related restrictions. Below that, although the majority of information indicates organizers are planning a peaceful event, many social media posts suggest some participants may attempt to disrupt government buildings and further cause disruptions throughout the city. Was that information conveyed to you?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Scrolling down again to page 2, please. It is unknown how long the protesters plan to stay in Ottawa. However, the RCMP has located social media posts indicating some participants may stay around the downtown core until January 31st in hopes to disrupt the House of Commons sitting that day. So was that information conveyed to you? And more broadly, can you tell us what your expectation was before the convoy arrived of how long it would or might stay?
That information was conveyed to me and a number of other colleagues at cabinet level, and my immediate reaction was to question the quality of the intelligence about the duration with which this protest was going to occur. One of the things that struck me was that there were reports about a significant number of vehicles that were coming from across the country, and it certainly seemed to me that just given the amount of time that it would take to get to Ottawa and other locations in the country where these demonstrations would occur, that there may very well be an intention to stay longer than the short period of time that some of those initial briefings had suggested that they would stay there. Combined with some of the public statements around the original manifesto, which in my opinion was the spark for the so-called Freedom Convoy, the stated political and ideological objectives within that document to force the government to reverse course on pandemic policies or else to see the government overthrown or resigned, suggested to me that there may be an entrenchment. And as time went on, we certainly started to probe those questions more once they arrived at the end of January.
Okay, so just to sum that up and to make sure I have it right, when you say question the intelligence, you sort of, do you mean question the assessment in the end of the conclusion that this is likely going to be gone by the end of the weekend? Or you were concerned that it would stay longer than that?
That's correct.
Okay. Scrolling down to page 3, please, Mr. Clerk. We see, there we go, perfect. With respect to the threat picture, there has been an increase in online narratives supportive of the convoy among both ideologically motivated networks. We've heard a lot about ideologically motivated networks in IMV over the past week or so, as well as in general public discourse. And then scrolling down a little bit more, the convoy is attracting individuals who are not aligned with any specific ideology or group, but who have experienced personal hardships such as job loss due to COVID-19 and are upset with provincial or federal government responses as COVID continues to impact daily life. Open source monitoring has identified associated posts advocating violence, and there's potential for anti-government groups to join the demo with violent intentions. Then it talks about online posts feeding the conspiracy narrative with misinformation and disinformation, raising tensions. Scrolling down a little bit more, please, Mr. Clerk. Open source reports also suggest that police are setting up roadblocks, and such reports seem to fuel, no pun intended, some truckers' agitation. A post to the event Facebook group asked for known MPs' addresses in Ottawa, including the PM's residence and cottage, and this suggests that the convoy should break apart to these locations. Is that all information that was conveyed to you?
Yes, and if I could just be permitted to expand briefly, because you touched on a few important points, and if I could just ask for the technicians to scroll back up. So right under the words on January 22nd, 2022, there's a number of bullet points that I just want to shed some additional light on. So the fact that the convoy was attracting individuals with different grievances was one of the phenomenon around the expressly stated ideological, political, and in some cases extreme stated objectives of the Freedom Convoy. And I mean, this was something that again was a recurring theme in our discussions with law enforcement, with the security and intelligence community. The fact that it was pulling in people with different grievances, not just in relationship to the pandemic, but grievances regarding the government and other democratic institutions. Similarly, the potential for violence was stated at the outset. I mean, there was a number of very public statements by individuals like Pat King, who had said that that this could end in bullets, or that it would end in bullets potentially, was a signal of intent. At least that was my opinion. That certainly not all. I mean, there were many thousands of Canadians who participated in these demonstrations and in the blockade who were there for entirely legitimate and lawful purposes, but some were prepared to become violent. There's a bullet point there about threats to public figures. We were concerned about whether or not the blockade might target the Prime Minister, and then, as you will have heard by now, there were subsequent many threats that were made towards not only elected public figures, but equally law enforcement and representative of the media, which to me, again, signaled that this was a movement that in some cases was prepared to attack our democratic institutions to force change around policies.
Okay, I'll just stop you there and scroll down to the next page, please, Mr. Clerk, because I think this is, or actually I think it's page 6. This is touching on the point that you just made, Minister Mendeccino. So at the top of that page, it says effective January 11th, something, for announcements and public functions has been put in place for 8 individuals, and it lists off Minister Joly, Freeland, yourself, a few other ministers, and Dr. Tam. And without obviously getting into what's behind that Section 37 redaction, is it fair to assume that that means that there was a security risk identified?
That's exactly correct. And the RCMB had briefed in the early days of the convoy, certainly within the first week, that there needed to be a significant change in the security posture regarding the ministers that are in that paragraph. And in part, I think that was a response to the heightened degree of posts that were violent in nature, the overtly criminal threats that were being made against the lives and the security and safety of identifiable public figures. And so as a result of that, the security detail did change around a number of both me and my colleagues in cabinet.
Okay, and last point on this, if we just scroll down a little bit more, you'll see a line that says concerns from Minister LeBlanc specifically. And we'll be hearing from Minister LeBlanc later on today, but it says Minister LeBlanc has reached in to Minister Mendeccino, noting MPs are concerned for their safety and amid reporting of demonstrators attending their residences. This is being taken into consideration as part of the above planning for deployment of resources.
And I think that is worth emphasizing as well, because in addition to the security that was provided to ministers in cabinet, there was a heightened security posture around the Hill and around being able to access Parliament. And indeed, one of my main concerns was that, given, again, some of the stated objectives by some, including the potential to become violent, that we were just returning from winter session, And the first day of the resumption of Parliament coincided with one of the early days in the blockade and subsequent occupation right here in Ottawa. And I was worried about a significant number of people being able to both ingress and egress from the Hill. And so there was a heightened security posture so that we could continue to host Parliament or to hold Parliament. It was a very important priority that Canadians see that the business of government continue, notwithstanding the blockade and the convoy. But there were challenges, and I had many conversations with parliamentarians, disproportionately women, I would point out, who were the recipient of harassment, intimidation, expressions of hate through the convoy. So that additional security was very much driven by the reality on the ground.
Okay, that was actually my next question, whether these concerns were based on sort of identified threats having been identified, I'm going to use that word twice, but by the intelligence services or by law enforcement, or whether these were based on what was being seen on social media, or based on essentially complaints or worries expressed by members of Parliament and the individuals involved.
All of the above. And so it was a combination of what we were seeing on the ground in the activities of the convoy. And probably the most aggressive demonstration of their presence was the parking of ultimately hundreds of trucks on Wellington Street, which is one of the main arteries that runs through the parliamentary precinct. And again, I'll just pause here. I mean, that visual suggested to me that we were going to be in it for quite some time rather than just the weekend. But I'll come back to that. I'm sure that the RCMP were taking into account what they were seeing online, what they were hearing from various parliamentarians regarding potential security threats. And so for all of those reasons, again, security was elevated, not only for cabinet, but for parliamentarians and for staff who were working in the parliamentary precinct.
Okay, and we will get to the actual arrival of the convoy, but there's one more document I'd like to pull up before we get there. So, Mr. Clerk, that is ssm.nsc.can 401809. And so this, Minister, may go to what you were just expressing about your heightened level of concern. This is Friday, January 28th at around noon. So this is as the convoy would be starting to roll in. You send an email to Mike Jones. Can you tell us who Mike Jones is? Because his name will come up a few times, I think, this morning.
Mike Jones is my chief of staff, and the email that you have put up, which is dated Friday, January 28th at about 5:38 p.m., reflects the questions that I intend to put to the table. So looking at latest estimate on numbers, both in terms of vehicles and people, trying to ascertain whether or not there was any intelligence of individuals who may be on a watch list regarding threats to national security. The third question that I put in the email there, which is written as latest on what-if scenarios. What I was really, I think, foreshadowing was a discussion around potential contingencies. Like, what if the convoy doesn't disengage? What if they don't leave? And from a very early point, as I had said earlier, had concerns that this was not just going to be a 1 or a 2 day event, that it was going to last much longer. And so I wanted to extract from the community, the law enforcement community, the intelligence community, what do we do if that's the case? How do we make sure that we keep public safety, and what are the contingencies around that?
Okay, so just a couple of things. The first is for the record and for ease of understanding. You'll see the notation plus 4 zeros there. That means that the timestamp is in Greenwich Mean Time, so it's minus 5 hours. So that was around 12:30.
There you go.
And as you say, you're asking what if scenarios. What if they don't leave? What if it lasts beyond Monday? What if it turns violent? What if they come before parliamentary residences? And we know now at this point that what ended up happening as of, I think, January 28th was a group of ministers consisting of yourself, I believe Minister LeBlanc, Minister Blair, and Minister Algabra were briefed daily by a variety of officials from PCO and various agencies under public safety. Would that have been done in response to this request?
I think it was understood early on that we were going to need to take a whole of government approach responding to the convoy. So the initial group that you just highlighted of ministers was eventually expanded, and then ultimately, as I'm sure we'll get into, the Prime Minister convened a meeting of the Incident Response Group, which included a number of others. But I should highlight the two last points which are in the email to Mike Jones, which suggests that at the time I was also concerned about making sure that we were staying up on threat assessments as well to senators, as well as the Governor General, in addition to elected parliamentarians. And finally, I wanted to get a sense of what outreach was being done to the organizers. And my thinking there was, let's try to allow for the space for a lawful protest, keep it within the boundaries of the law, because it is a hallmark of our democracy that people can take opposing different views. And so I wanted to make sure that there was some lines of communication with the organizers of the convoy from the early days.
Okay. So we'll just skip a little bit ahead now. So the convoy arrives, it doesn't leave on Sunday or Monday as expected, and then we're into the first week of the protests. So I'll ask you a few questions about what that first week was like from your perspective, and with the assistance right now of the following document, PB.Can 401870, please. Okay, so Minister Mendeccino, this is a text from Mike Jones, who's in the blue. Well, there's no one else, I think, and it's not blue, but there we go. Now it's blue. And the text is to Brian Clow. Can you tell us who Brian Clow is?
Yes, Brian Clow is the Deputy Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister.
Okay, so just scrolling down a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk, so we can see the text. So this is Sunday, February 6th, and Mr. Jones, Mike Jones, writes to Mr. Clow, so my boss, that would be you?
Yes.
Is pretty amped up. He's concerned that OPS have lost jurisdiction as there's no control at all over what's happening on Wellington. Also concerned for PM safety if he is returning to this week. What does that mean if he was returning this week? Just pausing there.
My recollection is that he was out of Ottawa for some period of time and then would be returning to Ottawa and to ultimately the House of Commons, and so I was outlining my concern about his ability to, for him and his staff and the RCMP that work with him, to protect him, to get into and out of Parliament safely, because by then, and the date of this text is Sunday, February the 6th. So we're fully now, I think, about a week into the convoy. And this would have been after the first weekend. And the concerns that I was expressing was that by that first weekend, it was my opinion that it was virtually impossible to enforce the law on Wellington Street, given the rampant behavior, not only the noise, that was being made by the excessive honking of horns well into the evening, but some of the early reports, and again, this bear in mind, this is Sunday, February 6th. By then, there were a number of press conferences that the Ottawa Police Service had held expressing serious concerns around the reports of intimidation, harassment, and violence. If memory serves, I think there was a press conference where the Ottawa Police Service had indicated that there were reports of firearms that had been brought into the nation's capital. And subsequently, again, I'm going from memory, but there was at least one arrest that was reported of somebody that was making their way potentially to the convoy where the firearm was seized. There were efforts, I think, by law enforcement to try and get the situation under control, but they were overwhelmed. So there were a series of events leading up to the text that Mike Jones had sent to Brian Clow that had led to my concerns being elevated about our ability to restore public safety on Wellington Street in the nation's capital, which is the seat of the federal government. I would also just add that my concerns were not just about Ottawa, that by then there were already reports as well about borders being blockaded. And I would just recall for you and for Judge Rouleau that in my job as Minister of Public Safety, I'm not just looking at the nation's capital or the parliamentary precinct. I'm looking at the entire country. And so by then, a number of critical infrastructure and borders had become either the target of or, in fact, blockades, which had a significant impact on critical supply chains. So there was a lot that was, I think, I'm interpreting and extracting a little bit exactly from the language, but I think that's what Mike Jones was conveying to Brian Clow.
Okay, so just scroll down a little bit more, Mr. Clerk. So the next part of the text says he wants to go out, that would be you want to go out and say that OPS needs to get control over the situation. And if they need more from OPP, they should make that clear, but they should get working on removals within the next 24 hours. And if they aren't going to do it, then we may need to look at other measures. Let me know if you want to discuss. So this represents where your thinking is, as you say, at the end of the first week. So this is Sunday, February 6th, and you've just told us why you've come to this viewpoint. Can I ask what you meant by we may need to look at other measures at that point?
At that point, I think looking at offering additional resources to local police, and there had been informal requests communicated to me and to my office for additional RCMP services, which we provided on a number of different occasions prior to the invocation of the act. So that was certainly one of the other potential measures that we could explore, which was how do we get more boots on the ground to help the Ottawa Police Service. And let's not forget the Ontario Provincial Police, who were the first stop if OPS, the Ottawa Police Service, could not restore public safety, and so that's what I believe I was foreshadowing at the time.
Okay, well, we're about to get into some of those resourcing discussions because the next topic we're going to cover is the tripartite meetings, what
Right.
we've come to know as the tripartites. So, Mr. Clerk, if you can pull up while I'm talking pb.nsc.can 402335. So you mentioned, Minister Mendeccino, that at this point there'd been a number of requests made from the Ottawa Police, from various, I think, provinces at this point even. There'd been an approach from Alberta, but we're not really getting into Alberta right now. But in any event, around the 7th or 8th of February, I believe it was the 7th, a decision was made that it would be a good idea to convene the federal, provincial, and municipal governments to discuss the situation in Ottawa and the way forward from there, including the provision of resources, as you mentioned. There are a lot of issues to cover that come out of the tripartites. We're going to focus on a few. A few of those issues are the RCMP resources, there's the lack of the OPS plan, and there's what seems to be expressed as a lack of engagement from the province of Ontario. So I'm going to take you through a few extracts that focus on some of those topics. So the document in front of us now is a readout of the February 7th tripartite, and that was the first tripartite meeting. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Scrolling down, Mr. Clerk, to when you see the initials MM. Okay, MM is Marco Mendeccino, that's you?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, Minister Mendeccino or Marco Mendeccino, one of the two. So, call last week with Watson was productive. It is a stressful period for you and Chief. Feels like things have turned around a bit today. We have confirmed 250 Mounties have been deputized, supporting local law enforcement. We have been timely and responsive in putting our response together. Minister Jones will want to have a discussion with what they can contribute. Letter addressed to, and I can scroll down, yeah, there we go, both PM and Premier, we are going to be in touch. Okay, so from your recollection, Minister, who attended that first tripartite meeting?
Well, from the federal level of government, myself, Minister Blair, our officials, some of our political staff, Mayor Watson, I believe his chief of staff, and I'm trying to recall whether or not there were any officials from the Ontario government not elected or not, but I mean, the majority of the participants were the political levels from the City of Ottawa, the federal government, and supporting staff and officials.
Okay, and that's fair. This isn't a memory test anyway, but so Minister Jones obviously did not attend because you were talking about getting her to attend in this exchange here. Okay, can we just scroll down again to page 2, please? Keep going a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk. There we go, where it says Watson on tripartite table. So the discussion before this pertains to RCMP numbers, how many resources are being provided. There's some frustration expressed throughout this by the Mayor of Ottawa, Mayor Watson, about how many RCMP boots are actually on the ground. So that's being discussed. And then we get to Watson on tripartite table. Has the province agreed to this? And Minister Blair then says, both of us have reached out, that would be you, and I. She wasn't able to join today, unfortunately. We'll continue to engage, to encourage them to join these talks. And then Mayor Watson expresses an opinion that the province is reluctant to be a part of what's going on, and then expresses some frustration about that. Would you agree with that characterization of Mayor Watson in that line, that the province was reluctant to be part of what was going on?
I would agree that at that particular point in time that there was a common desire to have Minister Jones or additional representation from Ontario at the tripartite meeting for the purposes of cooperating and coordinating the response to the convoy in Ottawa. Now, I would add that that's not to say that the province was not engaged at all. And I know, for instance, that Premier Ford had made a number of very strong statements about the state of the convoy, condemning it, saying, you know, it was out of control. He pronounced very definitively and declaratively that it was time for people to go home, if I recall correctly. That would have been before this tripartite. There were other conversations that I was having bilaterally around the tripartite. So I would say, despite the fact that they were not at that table, there were still conversations with Ontario. But yes, we would like to have seen them at the tripartite. There's no doubt about that.
Okay. And can we just scroll down again, please, Mr. Clerk? Last point, I think, on this one. Page 3, please, sorry. There we go, where it says again, Wellington. So Wellington has invoked a lot of images, but the sight of a crane, trucks in front of PMO, PCO are particularly concerning. Need to know from the chief what the plan is, and chief, there's Chief Slowly, what the plan is to have those vehicles removed. With appropriate boundaries on operational independence, how is the convoy being broken up and disengaged? Can I just ask you to speak at this point on what you meant there by appropriate boundaries on operational independence in this context?
Well, that's a very important question, because the principle of operational independence has to guide the relationship between police and the elected branch of government. And again, from my past professional experience as a prosecutor and as a practicing lawyer, I would have been very familiar, precisely because I had worked closely with police in a variety of different cases, and the need to respect that principle at all times. So I wanted to be sure that even as though we were asking questions of police to provide some detail and some clarity around how they intended to restore public safety, that at all times it was respectful of that principle. At the same time, I do think it bears emphasizing that police and the elected branch of government do not operate in two silos, and nor should we, that there needs to be a dialogue between both branches to be sure that police have the resources that they need, which was one of my core responsibilities in the response to the blockade, as well as potentially additional tools to respond to the unique and unprecedented nature of this convoy, which is something that we ultimately came to. So I know you may have more questions about operational independence, but I wanted to flag really early on that as we were asking questions, we were mindful of that. The other thing I would just stress, if I could, is that in ultimately forming the opinion that we needed to invoke the Emergencies Act, one of my main concerns was the inability to enforce the law adjacent to critical infrastructure, and that would have included Parliament. And the nature of the parliamentary precinct is such that Wellington Street falls within the jurisdiction of the Ottawa Police Service. So I was certainly trying to reconcile in my mind that these are federal democratic institutions, but we did not have total jurisdiction over that space. In other words, it wasn't at the sole or exclusive discretion of the RCMP, which is the federal police service, to go and assert itself on Wellington Street to bring the situation back into control. So we had to navigate different levels of government, including municipal and provincial, because Ottawa Police Service has that jurisdiction as of this moment. And if they did not have the resources to respond to the occupation at that point, including the ability to remove hundreds of large vehicles on Wellington Street, including the ability to remove a crane, which had been parked right adjacent to the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office, including the ability to simply enforce the law, then they could then next go to, they then statutorily, under the Ontario Police Services Act, could go to the Ontario government to ask for the Ontario Provincial Police Service to backstop any gaps there. But I would point out that there is no statutory link beyond that to go from the Ontario Police Service Act to the Emergencies Act. And I know that's something we're going to come to.
Okay, there's a lot you've said there, and we'll unpack that slowly but surely. But for the purposes of the discussion we're having right now about the tripartites, would it be fair to say that part of the idea in holding the tripartites would be to sort out the jurisdictional issue?
All of that. It was really to make sure that all of the key players at all three levels of government were able to navigate around the jurisdictional challenges and complexities, but beyond that, the situation on the ground, which, by then, as you pointed out in an earlier exhibit and text, was on the it was on the brink of being completely ungovernable, if not already by then.
Okay. We'll go now to the next tripartite, which is the following day, February 8th. Mr. Clerk, that's SSM.NSC.CAN 40/2052. So these are notes taken of that tripartite. Just again, to situate us a bit with the names here, Zita Astrovas, we've heard, is Minister Blair's Chief of Staff. Samantha Khalil, can you tell us who that is?
Samantha Khalil works in the Prime Minister's office, and I believe she works in the Issues Department of the Prime Minister's office.
Okay, so this is essentially a readout or notes from that tripartite on the 8th. Scroll down a little bit, Mr. Clerk. There we go. Good to be back on these calls. It's only been a day. Stay focused on the task at hand, received your letter, and the mayor then says, why no Solgen attendance? Solgen is Minister Jones?
That's correct.
Okay. And you say no word back. So you're conveying there that you attempted to call or attempted to contact Minister Jones and had not heard back at that point?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And then the mayor says he's speaking to the premier tomorrow and he will ask that his minister be at the table. He goes on to talk about a call that he'd had with the Prime Minister, which we went through in some detail a few weeks ago. And then Minister Blair chimes in on Ontario involvement and says, I know Marco's been having good conversations with Ontario. They are worried about being visible and then being asked about what the province is doing. Now, I appreciate that these are Minister Blair's words, not yours, but do you recall what he was talking about when he said they're worried about being visible?
Well, again, as you pointed out, these are my colleague Minister Blair's words that are being captured in a summary of a readout. I believe he was referring to the fact that at the point in time that we were having these trilateral conversations, that there was a lot of attention that was being placed on both the city of Ottawa as well as the federal government. And, I believe he was conveying a perception that Ontario wasn't at the table at the time. And so, again, what we really were driving at here, and as I think the summary communicates, was an effort to bring Ontario to the table. And I had reached out to Minister Jones, had not heard back at that point. I believe, if memory serves, I was able to get in touch with her shortly after that time, but it was really a full court press to try and have everybody at the trilateral table because, as we've discussed, there were operational complexities and jurisdictional complexities, and to the extent that we could be all aligned, then that would help to restore public safety.
Okay. And we'll get back to that topic. I'm going to scroll down and take you to something else I want to ask you about here. Sorry, scroll down a little bit, Mr. Clerk, until you see page 3. Slowly for every action. Should be a little bit down from there. There we go. So just scroll down. There we go. Thank you. Slowly. So this is Chief Slowly speaking. And you're asking, what does the trend look like for removal? Is it going slowly going down, or is it stop and start? And Chief Slowly says, for every action we do, there is a counter reaction that can exceed our resources. We saw that in Coventry. So he's discussing there the give and take, or the reactions and counter reactions in Ottawa specifically. But then he then says, our public request for 1,800 more people resulted in the activity in Windsor, plus a national call for protesters to drive to Ottawa so they can outnumber even increased police presence. There are national implications and local implications here. They are very well organized and able to mobilize people.
Yeah.
So can you expand a little bit on what you were hearing about that at that time, the level of organization, and to the extent that you were hearing this, and the interconnectedness or not of what was going on across the country?
That is a critically important intervention by Chief Slowly at the time for a couple of reasons. First, he's flagging as a very serious concern that locally they are outnumbered. And he says that it is exceeding or he suggests that it is very close to exceeding their current resources, which is why they had asked for some additional help, including from the RCMP, which by then we would have responded to. There were a couple of installations prior to the invocation of the act that I think numbered in the hundreds, somewhere between 200 at the outset, and then eventually getting up to about 500 all told. There were questions about exactly how those resources were being deployed by the RCMP in conjunction with Ottawa Police Service. But the real important point is he's saying we're outnumbered and we need help. That's what I took from that intervention. The other thing that he mentioned in that intervention is Coventry. And through a number of briefings in the lead up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, there was a discussion of two different groups that were at play in the blockades. There was a large group, again, of Canadians who were exercising their lawful right to protest against certain policies by the government. But then there was another group that had other more extreme objectives that was much more sophisticated and organized. And it's my recollection that latter group was interspersed in a number of different locations very tactically, but that there was a concentration of that latter group at Coventry Road that was made up potentially of individuals who had previously served in either the military or in law enforcement. And that to me raised a concern, a very serious concern, about some of the counter operations that could be run by that group to overwhelm legitimate law enforcement. And that, I think, is exactly what Chief Slowly is getting at. When, if numbers are being reported publicly about how many additional reinforcements are being sent in, then the word could go out to call for more protesters to descend into the nation's capital, or, again, quite frankly, to deploy across the country. And we did, and again, I would hasten to add, this was not just about Ottawa. This was about the entire country, where we would see the levels of protest go up and go down. And the time that I thought was most dangerous were typically the weekends. And that's when there was a surge of people who came and descended into the parliamentary precinct. And that if I read Chief Slowly right, was in part a tactical decision that was being informed by some within the group who had the skills and the experience to overwhelm whatever police resources were available at the time.
Okay, so going back to a few things you said there, the first one, you mentioned that there were some questions about boots on the ground and how many RCMP officers were being provided. And we've heard about that, but from your perspective as Minister of Public Safety, what was your understanding of what was going on there and why? Well,
my understanding was that Ottawa Police Service did not have the resources to respond at the time. And therefore, they were putting out a request for assistance from different levels of government and different levels of law enforcement, including the RCMP. And that is and so my response as Minister of Public Safety is, let's get you what you need. Let's get you the additional boots on the ground. And in dialogue with the commissioner of the RCMP, we were responsive to that request on more than one occasion, deploying additional RCMP members to assist to restore public safety here in the nation's capital. There was also other requests, including in Alberta, but we can come back to that.
Well, before we get to Alberta, when you say let's get you what you need, do you mean let's get you what you need from the RCMP, or let's get what you need from the OPP and then only then from the RCMP?
I wouldn't say that there was necessarily that strict sequencing. My job as Minister of Public Safety was to be responsive to the requests that were coming in from the City of Ottawa, vis-a-vis the Ottawa Police Service. And so we facilitated those requests. They were not, they were not necessarily subject to the Ontario Provincial Police responding at the time. I wanted to be as supportive as I could. I was very much sympathetic to the plight of the residents in Ottawa. I was very concerned for their safety and their security. We were beginning to see counter-protests manifesting because I think at that time residents felt that they had to take matters into their own hands. That was extremely concerning to me because I thought that it represented a significant risk of more serious violence as a result of frustration and fatigue, and we were seeing an abundance of expressions of that in reporting and on social media. So I wanted to be as supportive as I could to the City of Ottawa and to the Ottawa Police Service. And Chief Slowly, I think rightfully was flagging his concerns about resource capacity and potential counter operations that were being run by the blockade and the occupation.
So getting back to that last concern about the counter operations, the action, the reaction, were you concerned then that this could spiral into something where police resources would actually be overwhelmed and stretched beyond capacity across the country? Was that the nature of your concern, or was it in specific areas there wouldn't be enough available locally? Or was it a broader concern than that, or was it just the specific instances?
It was a broader concern that was national in scale. At the end of the day, in my opinion, this was an illegal protest that was national in scale, that occurred at critical infrastructure, including a number of borders and ports of entry, including at legislative assemblies, including here at the seat of the federal government. And the initial responses of law enforcement to get the situation back under control were clearly overwhelmed. And as a result of that, the consequences were devastating to people, to the economy, to our international relations. And so at all times, I was assessing not any one of these events in isolation, but rather the situation in its totality. And when looking at the timing of it and the concurrence of all of these events in the same short, critical period of time, the types of targets where the individuals were showing up for the express purposes of creating disruption and undermining public safety, and the type of tactics that were being used, which was through sheer size and force of people, of vehicles, and behavior, that this was a very singular and unprecedented event. So being able to assess all of that in its totality was very much part of my job to restore public safety and to maintain it.
Did you have any actual evidence of what Chief Slowly is referring to here, that interconnectedness? Or was this more, you saw a correlation, or Chief Slowly is here, but you agreed with it, that one action then seems to have a counter reaction or provoke a response amongst protesters nationwide? Did that come from evidence, or did that come from essentially observation?
It came from observation. What I was seeing with my own eyes on the ground was that when police tried to enforce the law, they were overwhelmed. They were swarmed. There were reports about there being threats made to them as they tried to do their job. And they were clearly identifiable in uniform, indicating that it was time to go home. And these were not just interactions. I mean, they ultimately did lead to hundreds of criminal charges being laid, including assault of a peace officer, which is a very serious offense to be charged with. This was all a counter-reaction to the reaction of law enforcement to try and restore public safety on the ground. And it wasn't just in Ottawa. It was at ports of entry at the Pacific Highway, in Surrey, in British Columbia, where again, there were very clear statements by Canada Border Service agents as well as local law enforcement there through the RCMP that it was time to go home. And in the face of those instructions, not only did participants double down, I mean, there's a very notorious incident involving a large vehicle that was painted with military fatigues that tried to crash a barrier. To me, that poses a serious threat of violence. And I think we'll come to Coutts, Alberta, which was, again, a very, and arguably the most egregious risk that coincided with the blockade. But I was at all times both using the observations that I was making for myself, as well as the advice and the intelligence that I was receiving in my capacity as Minister of Public Safety.
Okay, and we will come there. But first, I'm going to take you through now to sort of close the loop. Sorry, you can take this one down, please, Mr. Clerk. So can you just pull up quickly ssm.can.ns C402676. This is the third and last tripartite, and there's just a couple of things I want to highlight here, Minister, ask you about, which is, sorry, here we go. Let's just scroll down a little bit more. Thanks, latest from RCMP, okay. So towards the middle of that paragraph, you say, phase has moved beyond inconvenience or disruption. So this is now February 10th. They have moved to disrupting the economy. We are having very intentional conversations with the province about how confident they are around enforcement, the ability to take appropriate action quickly and decisively, whether in Ottawa, Windsor, Sarnia, et cetera. Spoke to Minister Jones. It was a focused conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing back from her on what OPP can do to assist you. Okay, so I'll take it from that, and we'll get back to the conversation with Minister Jones, but Minister Jones was not at the third and last tripartite here. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So Thank you, Mr. Clerk. So I'm just going to try and put together the chronology of what happened here, and I'll take you back to February 5th. SSM.can 407854. This is a text exchange between you and Minister David Lametti. And just scroll down a little bit, please, Mr. Clerk. I'm not sure what you're referring to. You say, you were perfect today. Thanks. So were you, buddy. Then should I? So the blue is Minister.
Little collegial support at a very stressful time.
Slash bromance. Okay.
I think he might resent that suggestion.
So were you, buddy. Should I call Downey? You've spoken to Sylvia. Downey, there would be a reference to Doug Downey?
That's correct.
Okay. Can you tell us who, just for the record, can you tell us who Doug Downey is and why Minister Lametti might be calling him?
He's the Attorney General of Ontario. He's Minister Lametti's provincial counterpart.
Okay. And so you have spoken to Sylvia, he says, and you say, I have spoken with Sylvia. You should call Downey. We need them in the right space to respond to any RFA for OPP assistance. And then Minister Lametti replies, spoke to Doug Downey, needs slowly to be quick, quick, quick. Can you tell us why would Minister Lametti be calling Doug Downey about this? So you're speaking to your counterpart, he's speaking to his. And what capacity would that be?
Well, again, I mean, you're asking me to interpret or infer why Minister Lametti has reached out to Doug Downey. The best answer that I can offer is I believe he is reaching out to a provincial counterpart to understand what Ontario's response is to the situation, not only in Ottawa, but elsewhere, including in Windsor at the Ambassador Bridge. And by then, the blockade was causing significant interruption to the economy. Again, thousands of people were temporarily laid off. Businesses were impacted in the auto manufacturing sector. So I think he's trying to gain some understanding from the Attorney General of Ontario about perhaps what advice he is offering to the Ontario government. Again, I'm drawing some inferences here, but I think it's a combination of that. But I think more broadly, just to keep lines of communication strong between the federal government and the government of Ontario. Okay,
so you actually asked him to call Downey. So do you have a recollection of why, or is it essentially what you just told us?
Yeah, no, actually, there it is right there. Yes, so I would say that was my thinking at the time, was to try and keep lines of communication open and to be sure that that we had some understanding about, you know, what advice may be provided to the Ontario government.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Clerk, next document is ONT 401141. So I understand that there was a call that took place between you and Minister Jones on the 7th. In that earlier text exchange, you seem to refer to an earlier call before the 5th. I don't know if do you have any recollection of that one?
I'm sorry, which document am I looking at here?
Sorry, yeah, that's my fault. The last document, the text exchange with Minister Lametti, you say, I have spoken with Sylvia, and that appears to be on the 5th. So do you remember a conversation prior to the 5th?
In the context of the blockades, not off the top of my head at this moment.
Well, we know that one happened on the 7th, and
yes.
This document is Minister Jones's notation of that call. And she says, so she's talking to you, Marco Mendeccino, Jim Watson wants an interlocutor. I think that may mean interlocutor, but I'm not sure. Wellington will be fast and jurisdiction FTP table to support the city, 1500 OBP 38 Kitchener. Can you tell, so the interlocutor, is that a reference to an interlocutor? Was that part of the discussion you were having?
You know, again, if we could have the document just scrolled back up to the top, I just want to, February the 7th, Jim Watson. I agree with you. I think that the word there may be misspelled and is referring to an interlocutor. And, you know, beyond that, I I couldn't say much more about that particular note, but I did have a conversation with Minister Jones
Yes, you did. And
around that time.
Pardon me?
Around that time or shortly thereafter.
Okay, and we're going to get to a report of what was said in that conversation as well. But before we get there, I want to just go through a little bit the call you subsequently had with with Premier Ford, because at this point, so can you take us through that? Minister Jones doesn't. You have a conversation on the 7th. Actually, why don't we go there now?
Yep.
So that conversation is reported in a text exchange. Can you pull up, Mr. Clerk, ssm.nsc.can 403127? So while that's getting pulled up, this is a text exchange on February 11th between Samantha Khalil, who you've told us is a PMO staffer, Mike Jones, your chief of staff, and Theda Astravas. And so Samantha says, thanks, guys, long day. Okay, so writing here is Mike Jones, your chief of staff. And, oh no, I'm sorry, this is Sam Khalil, I think, writing here. She says, hey, so on trilateral meeting, got it wrong again, it's Zeta writing. So Ms. Astravas says, hey, so on trilateral meeting, Sam, I don't know what you think, but I really think we need Jones at the table. Perhaps your boss can push again. Your boss there, so Mike Jones, he's talking about you. He says, by Jones, I assume you mean Ontario, and can have my boss reach out again, but the last call got pretty frosty at the end when he was saying, we need the province to get back to us with their plan. Quote unquote, I don't take edicts from you, you're not my fucking boss. Scroll down again. Yes, obviously not you, she said that. Does that accord with your recollection of the conversation you had with Minister Jones?
There was definitely some colorful vernacular towards the end of that call. I'm happy to say that both Minister Jones and I still enjoy a very productive and positive rapport. But the real thrust of the call was to engage Minister Jones to understand exactly where her thinking and where the government of Ontario's thinking was at in responding to the requests of Ottawa Police Service to get additional resources, and more broadly speaking, to restore public safety on the ground. And you know, I think certainly by the end of the call, it was quite clear that the inability of law enforcement using existing authorities to restore public safety on the ground was of increasing concern to me in my capacity as the Minister of Public Safety, as well as the federal government. And we wanted to be sure that Ontario was exercising all of its capacity to support not only Ottawa, but other communities as well in this province, including Windsor. So it was an important engagement. It was obviously a very stressful time, and you know, I think that we could all be forgiven for some rather blunt language. I'm sure you know we've all heard it in various interactions, but having those lines of communications open was critically important at that time.
Okay, so regardless of the language, it's fair to say you were encountering some resistance in obviously coming to the tripartite table, and it was described as a call that didn't go well. And we know that on the 9th, you spoke directly with Premier Ford. So we can take that document down, please, and we'll pull up the readout of your call from Premier Ford, which is ssm.can.nsc 402832. How did that call arise? Did you call Premier Ford? Did he call you? Tell us how that happened.
The Premier called me, and by then, again, it's important to place the timing and the chronology of this call into the broader context. This would have been February 9th, so we're now beyond a week into the occupation here in the nation's capital, and with significant interruptions at critical infrastructure and borders, including at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, at the Windsor-Detroit border, which quite clearly is in the province of Ontario. The Premier called me to, I think, express a few things, and the readout is there on the screen. But But one, I think he was calling to keep lines of communication open with the federal government. Two, he was indicating to me that his chief public health officer was going to be going out in the very short term to communicate the end of vaccine passports and the end of mandates. But he also was very supportive and said that he was prepared to stand with the Prime Minister, which I took as as a very constructive suggestion to show unity across different levels of government responding to what was then a very urgent state of crisis and emergency. And having that demonstration of solidarity, I thought, would reassure Ontarians and Canadians. I also did say to him that I would relay what I interpreted to be a bit of a nudge by Premier Ford around the federal government's posture around pandemic policy to the Prime Minister, more broadly just the fact that the call had occurred. And I did take the opportunity to express to him two really important things. First, I was really concerned about restoring public safety at critical infrastructure, including the Ambassador Bridge. And I also said that I was concerned that even if there was an announcement around a change in pandemic policy, that they may not leave. I think in the end that proved to be true. And then finally, I said that we needed Sylvia, and there I'm referring to Minister Jones, at the table, and I'm referring to the tripart table, and I asked that the Premier instruct her to be there.
Okay, so I think you've taken us through pretty much all of that. On the point of stand with the PM, we'll just pull up another document, which is ssm.nsc.can40s2952. So this is a text while it's being pulled up to Katie Telford, who's the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. You send her a text sort of reporting on this call with Premier Ford. And did I get the wrong document number? It appears that I did. Okay, you know what? I'll read it to you. We can look for the document number in a second. It says, just got call from Ford. They're pivoting. He will announce they're lifting passports, possibly more measures. Said he would stand with the PM, and then you said I would relay. I said the situation at Ambassador Bridge is serious. It's hurting working families, killing jobs. So by stand with the PM, you said, I didn't quite catch what you said you thought that meant. Stand beside the PM and?
My interpretation from Premier Ford saying that to me directly was that he wanted to show solidarity with the federal government in responding to this emergency. And I thought that was a constructive suggestion because it would reassure Ontarians and Canadians more broadly that different levels of government were working together to restore public safety, to keep people safe, which was my job. And my request to him to have Minister Jones attend the tripartite was an effort to show that alignment at all levels of government, not only from Premier to the Prime Minister, but equally from at the ministerial level in the portfolio of public safety, because by being at the same table at the same time, we could really troubleshoot issues together, including, again, some of the operational challenges that police were having, again, not only in Ottawa, but right across the province, and equally some of the jurisdictional complexities, and whether or not there were any other measures or tools that we could offer from the elected side of the government to police if it were necessary.
Okay. For the record, Mr. Clerk, the document number is ssm.nsc.can40s2952. So what I wanted to ask you, Minister Mendeccino, was did you sense that, or was your interpretation that standing with the PM was in any way tied to what you described, I think, as a gentle nudge to ease public health measures?
No, it wasn't. And again, I think we saw subsequently in the lead up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act that following the first minister's meeting that the Prime Minister and Premier Ford we're very much on the same page about the necessity of having to invoke the Emergencies Act. And at that point, the government had not yet taken a final decision with regards to pandemic policy in specific regards to vaccines.
Okay. The last point I want to ask you about on all of this is to get your reaction to something we heard from Mr. Mario Di Tommaso when he testified, which was, and I'll paraphrase what he was saying, but essentially part of his thinking or his explanation of why Ontario was reluctant to participate in the tripartites is that insofar as these were a forum to discuss policing resources, Ontario, the governmental officials shouldn't be participating in that because that's a law enforcement matter. The question of deploying police resources is something for law enforcement, not for governmental officials. What's your take on that in the context of what we'd raised earlier about the lines of operational dependence of the police?
Yeah, here again, this is a very important question. First, I can't speak for the Deputy Minister of Public Safety or the Solicitor General in Ontario, but from where I sat, the Premier of Ontario actually showed very important leadership in the early days of the blockade, going out publicly saying that this had no longer was a lawful protest and that people needed to go home. And that was a signal, I think, to any fair-minded individual who abides by the law that the situation was no longer safe. I would also point out that, you know, in the context of the discussion around operational independence, and I've obviously given this a fair bit of reflection since the occupation, and I did touch on it a little bit earlier, that there are important boundaries that should not be crossed by elected officials. And for good reason. We do want to safeguard against the politicization or making partisan important and independent decisions which are made by law enforcement and the prosecution services around the country so that we can preserve the integrity of the administration of justice. And at all times, we adhere to that principle in the federal government. That having been said, there does need to be a dialogue, and there is a dialogue between police and the elected branch of government when it comes to providing additional resources and tools. And I can offer a number of, you know, very concrete examples, not only in the general, but in the specific context of our response to the blockade. So if I could, when I received a call at the beginning of February from the Premier of Alberta, the then Premier of Alberta, Jason Kenney, one of the concerns that he'd expressed is that he and Alberta did not possess either the resources or the tools to clear the blockade at Coutts, which had mobilized pretty much since the end of January or beginning of February. And as part of the federal government's response to that situation, I authorized under Article 9.3 of the existing police services agreement between Canada and Alberta the deployment of additional police resources. That is a very concrete example of how we have customized through convention the relationship between the elected government and the authorities that are exercised through this office, the Minister of Public Safety, in response to the operational decisions that are taken by police to restore public safety. I would say more broadly, there are other important examples where elected representatives that occupy this office are responsive to the needs of police around tools, be it in, responding to either this situation or others. And obviously there are the priorities around the foreign deployment of RCMP in different countries, for example, in Ukraine, which are priorities which can be set by the elected branch of government where conventional police forces are deployed. So I guess my broader point is that both in the specific context of the blockade, but even beyond in the general, there does need to be a dialogue. And there was a dialogue between the elected branch of government and the police, who were exercising operational independence at every time to ensure that we could get them the additional resources that they need in the parts of the country where they needed it. And again, I emphasize and stress, this was not just an isolated incident, that these events were occurring across the country so that we could restore public safety.
When the RCMP officials testified last week, so Deputy Commissioner Duhaime and Commissioner Brenda Leckie testified, there's a few things that came out of their evidence that I want your reaction on. One of them is that I believe Commissioner Leckie said that there were times, or I think it was Deputy Commissioner Duhaime, said that there were times where it may have felt to him like officials may have stepped a little over that line between church and state. Now, I think they did say specifically, I recall Commissioner Leckie saying that she never felt pressured by her ministers, you and Minister Blair. She did say that at some point you sort of had to educate or educated, and she didn't point to any sort of instance where it was necessary, but she said you educated, and it fell to you essentially to educate the rest of cabinet. I think it was the February 10th IRG
Right.
on where that line was and the importance of operational independence. Do you recall that?
I do, and I wanted to be sure that as colleagues around the cabinet table were expressing the same concerns that I had, that others had about the ineffectiveness of existing authorities and resources to restore public safety up to that point, and we are approaching now 2 weeks into the blockade, that nevertheless, we should not violate the principle of operational independence because, again, just situate yourself in our shoes for just a moment. Our paramount concern is restoring public safety. And by then, there were countless reports of the very dire consequences that had been visited upon Canadians. But that could never be a license for assuming the roles and the responsibilities of police when it came to making the tactical and operational decisions around how to restore public safety. So it was important to strike a balance between respecting that principle, but also fulfilling my role specifically in holding the RCMP accountable for their role in restoring public safety, and more broadly, the government's role in understanding why it was that despite existing authorities and resources, we could not achieve the goal of getting a law and order back on the ground. And when I look back now and, I ask myself, and why it was in the perception of the commissioner that she felt that some, not all, were coming up to the line, it is because of the unique and singular nature of this public order emergency. It was the fact that the scale of this was national. It was the fact that what sparked this movement, in the opinion of the government, was an expressly stated political objective that at times was expressed in violent terms that led to the entrenchment of a significant number of individuals to ignore the direction of law enforcement at the risk and at the peril of Canadians. It was the challenges that we had in government around having the appropriate intelligence tools to understand how those initially stated objectives could pull in people from many different walks of life with different backgrounds and different grievances and coalesce them around something that so significantly and persistently caused significant interruption to public safety, to the economy, to our international relations. And all of that was, I think, part of the reason why people were really trying to probe and understand that despite the fact that you had a criminal code, you couldn't use it. Despite the fact that you had provincial statutes around the Highway Traffic Act, they couldn't be effectively used. Despite the fact that we had tow trucks, we had many tow trucks, that they could not be deployed to clear the blockades. And all of that was leading to an escalation of the risk and the threat of serious violence as time went on. And that is why I think that the commissioner both signaled her concern, but also appreciated my intervention, that we still had to be respectful of that principle of operational independence.
Okay, so just to go back on that a little bit, I mean, what we've heard over the weeks that we've been here at the commission, there's what could be described as quote unquote pressure all over the record. So there's a real sense of urgency from politicians and from officials. We need to do something about this now. We need to do this quick. We need to do, this has to end, et cetera, et cetera. And how does that not constitute? Can you explain how that does not constitute pressure on law enforcement to do something to clear up this protest in whatever way they can?
Well, to be clear, there was pressure on all of us. I mean, this was an extremely tense situation. I think that is just a natural reaction to all of the events that were occurring. But the reason why I'm confident, and the reason why I believe Commissioner Lucky testified that we didn't violate the principle of operational independence, is because at no time were we instructing police on how to do their job on the ground. So at no time were we saying, you must arrest people under the following provisions of the law. You must prosecute these people, to the fullest extent. You must, to the granularity of detail, deploy, 5 people here and 100 people there, and to prioritize all of these operations. We, at all times, steered clear of that zone, which would have been a violation of the principle of operational independence. And that's why I think I'm, very confident that that we didn't cross that boundary.
Okay, so the line is politicians and the government has a role to play in expressing a desire, let's say, or the need to solve a situation, but not in telling the police how to do it?
That's right. You don't want me as an elected official putting on a badge or a uniform and going out there and doing the job that police are there to do. That's not my role. That's not my responsibility. However, it is my responsibility as Minister of Public Safety to be accountable to Canadians when it comes to equipping police with the tools and the resources that they need to restore public safety. And by then, on February 10th, we did not have public safety in the nation's capital and at other critical infrastructure across the country. And so because of that, we really wanted to understand why existing authorities were ineffective at that point, and that was the balance that we struck.
Another issue that we've heard a lot about over the last few weeks is the idea, the notion of one could put it as negotiating, or we could put it as engaging with demonstrators or protesters. So we've heard that was an issue that was discussed. Is there a way to sort of to end this or to ameliorate this by engaging directly with demonstrators? There's reference in Sylvia Jones's notes of the February 7th call to having an interlocutor engage with the protesters. And we've heard a lot about an effort by your Deputy Minister Rob Stewart, around the 10th, 11th of February, to create what's become known as the engagement proposal. So can you tell us a little bit from your perspective how those engagement efforts, if I can put it that way, and eventually the engagement proposal came to be and evolved?
Engagement was always an option, and I had articulated on a number of occasions that law enforcement should be the last resort. And you saw from one of the exhibits that you had put to me a little bit earlier in my testimony this morning that I had turned my mind right at the very beginning of the briefings that it was important for there to be some engagement with those who were participating in the convoy and the blockade, and wanted to be briefed on that by law enforcement, who I thought was the most appropriate actor in this context to be engaging with. Given that, in my estimation, that it was operational and tactical, that didn't mean that that I wasn't still having conversations with individuals outside of law enforcement about an engagement proposal, but there was early contemplation and reflection about having an engagement strategy. I would say beyond that, there were conversations between the Prime Minister and myself about searching for a suitable mediator or interlocutor, someone who would have had the experience to de-escalate and resolve situations that are complex. And beyond that, by the time we got to the ERG, there was a report that was given by Deputy Minister Stewart about information that he had gleaned from conversations that he was having with the Ontario government and the OPP around the intelligence of what the group was constituted of in terms of adherence to, ideology, the desire to, double down and hold the line and et cetera, and all of that, versus everybody else who might have just been there to express another point of view. And so as a result of that report that he offered at the ERG, there were taskings that were listed by the clerk of the Privy Council at the end of that meeting, one of which was to continue to develop a potential engagement strategy. And so that's what the Deputy Minister set about to do. And I know that there was some additional work on that front.
Okay, so this is, you knew that you were aware that this was being worked on by your Deputy Minister?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Clerk, can we pull up ssm.nsc.can 402958? So, Minister, this is a text from you to Katie Telford, the PM's Chief of Staff. The date of it is February 11th. It's at 6:49 p.m. So just to situate you in time, the ERG happens on February 10th. There's no ERG, I think, on February 11th. So you write to Ms. Telford, hey there, we got some very last minute and thin paper tonight on an engagement strategy from my DM, who apparently socialized it with PCO, our CMP commissioner, and the Ontario government, and not me. We only found out about it during a call tonight I placed to him. The DM's outreach during the day to the Ontario government on this engagement proposal resulted in the Ontario Deputy Solicitor General sending my DM a draft letter addressed to unnamed protesters proposing engagement, which would be co-signed by Ontario government and an unnamed official from the federal government. It's unclear whether PCO, our CMP, or Ontario government has given their support to the engagement proposal. Flagging as a concern and inconsistent with good info flow, I've addressed with him, wanted you to know. I will be replying to DM and letting him know. Then there's some redactions, and the last thing you say is, sorry, but had to let you know. Can you explain to us what you were expressing in this text?
I'm expressing a concern that the Deputy Minister had socialized with a different level of government, an engagement proposal that I would have wanted to have some input into prior to that. And, again, admittedly, in this particular moment, everybody is working extremely hard, long hours, trying to quickly fulfill the tasks that had been accomplished fulfill the tasks that had been assigned, I beg your pardon, at the end of the last ERG. And so I wanted to be sure that we were together thinking through not only the engagement proposal, but also mitigating and thinking through some of the very real and practical considerations that had to be woven into the strategy if one was going to be deployed. For example, and I posed some of those questions, who are we going to send this to? Where is it going to take place? How can we be sure that if we do engage in it, that we can maintain public safety? Because the situation was extremely volatile and very tense. And among the concerns were whether or not there was actually any cohesive structure to the occupation at that moment in time. And so understanding who we were sitting down with was critically important. And so I wanted to be sure that that Ms. Telford was aware of that, because ultimately when we go back to Cabinet, I am responsible and accountable for my department, including the deputy minister, and wanted to be sure that I was equipped to answer any questions from colleagues about what this engagement proposal would look like. So, I say, again, in fairness to everybody, this was an exceedingly difficult and challenging time. And I know that that Deputy Minister Stewart was doing his level best to fulfill a task that had been assigned to him after the ERG, and was, I think, trying to action it and get some traction at the Ontario level of government. And we did have a good conversation about that. And, subsequently, I think as we saw on February 14th, that despite the efforts of the City of Ottawa to engage some of the members of the occupation here in Ottawa, that it ultimately unraveled, I think, for many of the reasons and concerns I previously articulated.
Okay, so your concern, if I understand it then, is not with the engagement proposal itself, with the work that was being done, it's the information flow.
Correct.
And the fact specifically that it had been socialized, as you put it, with the Ontario government without you knowing about it.
At that particular moment in time, and just wanted to be sure that I had a line of sight and understood it, and also that it was part of a broader effort by both me and others from within the government to explore engagement. And as I pointed out, seeking briefings and information from police right from the beginning about how we were engaging with members of the occupation. Equally, the conversations that I had with the Prime Minister around finding potentially a mediator to de-escalate so we could avoid law enforcement as much as possible. And, ultimately this engagement proposal as well. It was all a suite of things that we were doing together to really try to restore public safety as quickly as we could.
I believe Deputy Minister Stewart's evidence was that he hadn't socialized it with Mr. Di Tommaso, but with Commissioner Correa. So would that change your view at all as to whether that engagement was appropriate?
I'm not sure. I think the broader concern was just making sure that I could stay up to speed, and recognizing again the pressures on everybody to go about and complete these taskings. I just wanted to be sure both me and my staff had an opportunity to contribute to the idea before it got before it was shared with not only other branches of government, but as you pointed out, other branches of law enforcement. And I wanted to be sure we were really, staying on the same page. But it was an exceedingly difficult time, in fairness to the Deputy Minister.
Everything was happening very quickly. There's no doubt about that. The reason I asked you whether you were concerned about the proposal itself is because one of the bits of evidence we've heard is that Commissioner Lucky and the RCMP may have had some concerns about it, or about the proposal, in the sense that it may cross the line between church and state. So again, we're back to this issue of police independence, operational independence, and I'd like you to speak for a moment, if you could, about how the idea, where does political negotiation fall into that piece? And just for a little, to situate you in background, what we know now is that there were different lines of potential engagement going on almost simultaneously. There was an attempt at engagement in Windsor. There was an attempt on the part of Mayor Watson to corral trucks up onto Wellington Street and get them off the residential streets where they were disturbing the residents on those streets. And then there was the federal government's engagement proposal. So we have these different lines going at the same time. And that could arguably at least be put as something that makes it difficult for law enforcement to do their job. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I think it was extremely difficult for law enforcement to figure out how to engage in a constructive way with the occupation and the blockades, not only here in Ottawa, but across the country. I know from the early days that members of police liaison units, these are individuals within law enforcement who have very specific expertise in engaging with people who protest, to sort of set the boundaries of what just to be sure that everybody can be safe. So here's what we can all sort of agree to. And I think that there, as you've heard previously, there was some effort to do that, certainly at the local level here in Ottawa. But to come back to what I think that, like the core of your question is, you are absolutely right that it becomes a lot trickier and more complex once elected officials start to penetrate into the terms and the conditions by which you negotiate a disengagement of the blockades and the occupation, if it involves, let's say, the moving of vehicles, the moving of people, the moving of police officers. All of that, I would submit, is much more within the operational domain and, by extension, independence of police, which was one of the concerns that I had in navigating this appropriately. So that was, I think, part of what I was getting at in my text to Ms. Telford, was just I wanted to be able to think that through with everybody, and especially if we were going to be sharing it with other levels of law enforcement, so that we were respectful of those principles of operational independence as well.
Okay. I now want to ask you, turning to, we know the engagement proposal didn't go anywhere in the end. And we're chronologically, we're now getting to the crux of events and when the Emergencies Act was actually decided on. So I know it wasn't decided necessarily on the 13th, but that's the day we're going to talk about. There's some evidence, and I'll ask you if you know about this first. So shortly before, we understand there was an IRG meeting the afternoon of the 13th, followed by a meeting of the full cabinet in the evening at 8:30 p.m. The commission has seen evidence shortly before that 8:30 meeting. Commissioner Lucky sent an email, and let's get the email up. It is ssm.nsc.can 402280. So this is an email. The timestamp on it is it's just shortly before 8 o'clock once you do the Greenwich Mean Time adjustment. This is your Chief of Staff, Mike Jones, sending this to you and copied to Deputy Minister Stewart. Evening, Minister, responses from the Commissioner below. And this is, we've seen this already in the inquiry, so I won't go through it at length, but there's a sort of a wish list, or these are tools that could be effective. And then at the very bottom of the email, there. Commissioner Lucky says, this said, I am of the view that we have not yet exhausted all available tools that are already available through the existing legislation. There are instances where charges could be laid under existing authorities for various criminal code offenses occurring right now in the context of the protest. The Ontario Provincial Emergencies Act, just enacted, we skipped that in the narrative, but we know that happened February 11th, will also help in providing additional deterrent tools to our existing toolbox. So my first question, Mr. Mendeccino, is, did you see this before the cabinet meeting?
I don't recall exactly when I would have seen it. This, as you pointed out, was sent just prior to the commencement of the cabinet meeting. I will say to you, importantly, that a couple things. First, the commissioner did not express that opinion to me at any time directly, and I actually spoke to the commissioner earlier that day on February 13th, and while she did not at all address that last point that you raised in the email, she did call me, and only me, this was a conversation between just her and I, to be clear, to express her very grave concerns about the situation in Coutts. And she underlined for me that the situation in Coutts involved a hardened cell of individuals who were armed to the teeth with lethal firearms, who possessed a willingness to go down with the cause. And the reason why this was such a sensitive conversation was that we had RCMP undercover personnel deployed in the field. And she was justifiably concerned that there not be any leak of this information because lives literally hung in the balance. And for me, this represented far and away the most serious and urgent moment in the blockade to this point in time. And so it also spoke volumes to me about the commissioner's state of mind, which was that we were potentially seeing an escalation of serious violence with the situation in Coutts. And it certainly, I think, was in the broader context of the preponderance of the advice that we were getting from the commissioner at that time as a result of conversations not only in the ERGs about where there were gaps in authorities, in existing authorities to return public safety to the ground, could not have drawn any other inference that she was supportive, as she later expressed that she was, of the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. This was a singular moment for me in my mind. And it was so urgent that I said to her, well, look, I can't just keep this information to myself. At a minimum, I have to be able to share it with the Prime Minister, which I then subsequently took steps to do. Shortly thereafter, I reached out to Ms. Telford.
Sorry, just to be clear, which information are you talking about there?
About Coutts and about the potential for gun violence and for the loss of life, and the fact that there were RCMP personnel that were in the field, and all of this occurring literally within hours, not even days, of the invocation to the Emergencies Act. I was extremely concerned that this had reached a new height of both urgency and emergency. And so I felt I had a responsibility to let, at a minimum, the Prime Minister know and his staff know, while respecting the operational sensitivity at the most delicate levels to protect the people on the ground. And so I did that. I spoke to Ms. Telford afterwards, where I conveyed to her both the best information that I had at the time around Coutts, and asked her to keep this, to respect, in effect, the commissioner's request that we treat this information with the utmost sensitivity so that we could ensure that we were keeping people safe. But this was a threshold moment for me. There's no doubt about it.
And that was you had that conversation on the afternoon of the 13th?
That was the same day, yes.
Okay, so just to recap a little bit, you didn't see this email from Commissioner Lucky before the cabinet meeting?
Again, I'm trying very much to reconstruct the sequence of events. Things moved very, very quickly. It literally came in inside of a half hour of the commencement. So I don't want to say definitively I didn't see it. I was much more preoccupied with the actual direct conversation that I had with Commissioner Lucky earlier that day, where she had imparted to me perhaps the most urgent information to date with regards to the occupation and the blockades, and that was a threshold moment.
Okay, fair enough. So if you did see it, it didn't register as much as what she'd said about Coutts, put it that way. In your recollection, was that information put before cabinet? So we know that Commissioner Lucky wasn't called on to speak. Do you recall this being expressed to cabinet that evening?
No.
Okay. And you certainly obviously...
And I wasn't permitted to share, or I was asked not to share the information about Coutts with anyone else except for the Prime Minister, which I did.
Okay. If you had known this information, and I appreciate you're not entirely sure on whether you saw this information or didn't, would it have changed your mind at all?
I don't think so at that point. My interactions directly with the commissioner were actually going in the opposite direction, and certainly the fact that that we were on the precipice of engaging in an operation in Coutts where people were armed with a significant number of lethal firearms, where they possessed body armor, where there was intelligence or information that they had ideologically extremist views and symbolism that was attached to the group, that they were prepared to go down with the cause, was a very strong signal to me that the commissioner was of a heightened concern around the state of affairs. And again, it was consistent with the advice that we were getting contemporaneous to the decision of the invocation of the Emergencies Act around tools to address the gaps that existed. So, you know, the need to deploy RCMP officers, the need to procure essential services, importantly, the need to declare no-go zones or prohibition of assemblies. Let me just say on that last point that I wasn't just hearing about that from the RCMP. The CBSA had briefed Cabinet on at least one occasion for sure, if not more, about their explicit concerns about the lack of their authority and jurisdiction to clear roads on the way to the border. And so, you know, all of those powers were subsequently included in the declaration and the regulations under the Emergencies Act.
Okay, well, let's actually stop there for a moment. I'm going to go back to what we were talking about, but PB.Can 1864, please, Mr. Clerk. So this is a text from John Osofsky, president of the CBSA, the evening of February 13th. And he says, the gap, well, you asked, is it possible to direct CBSA officials to take a harder line, or is a heightened sense of vigilance as far as it goes? And he writes back, the gap is the fact that there is not an inadmissibility in IRPA, Immigration, Refugee and Protection Act, for coming to a protest. We have directed back 29 so far for other reasons as part of our enhanced vigilance. And you say, right, okay, so nothing we can do to strengthen our position there. I think our position broadly is that it's an illegal blockade, and it goes on. So that is, sorry, go on. Sorry, scroll down a little bit, please. If you're blocking a border hurting Canadians, it would warrant a tougher position. And then you ask, the 29 were sent back because it was believed they had violent intentions, or on what grounds were they sent away? We don't have the text after that. But first of all, is this a text conversation that was happening during the cabinet meeting that evening?
Well, I'd have to go back and take a look at the timestamps. But
about 9:23 p.m., I think.
Could very well have been. I assume it was. This is February 13th, right?
That's right.
Yes. So I would have been trying to really get a clarity of understanding about what the gaps were, and what the then president of the CBSA is expressing to me is that they need something that they don't have. And what they don't have at this moment in time is any existing authority to turn away foreign nationals who are attempting to enter into Canada where there are reasonable grounds to suspect that they may want to support what at this point is an illegal blockade. And so that is, again, a cry, an obvious request for some assistance here as a result of a gap in an authority. And there is a direct line between that gap and the subsequent powers which were included under the Emergencies Act. There is no other way for me to interpret the information that I'm getting from John Osofsky. It's certainly not to do anything about it. And subsequently, we did provide that authority, and there were, as my understanding recollects, at least, I think, one or two individuals who were turned away on February 19th by CBSA on the strength of the Emergencies Act authorities that were provided to them.
I think we know it was two, and the answer to the question here is that the 29 were sent back because under enhanced vigilance, because generally speaking, I think because they didn't meet the vaccination requirements.
I think your interpretation's right, and I think Mr. Osofsky he's communicating to me that we're working with what we got, but it's not enough, okay. And we're concerned that we don't have the authority that we need. And this was in addition to what I think is one of the other significant concerns that CBSA expressed to me and to other cabinet colleagues, which is that they did not have the authority or the jurisdiction to clear the roads leading to the border. And certainly that limited their capacity to keep the border open, and by extension, critical supply chains, food, fuel, health supplies, all the like, the people in the border communities. And I'm certainly familiar with the community in Windsor as a result of some family relationships. But people got to go about their daily lives. And this was completely impossible at that time. And so, I think he's expressing two very legitimate gaps. And so, again, the only interpretation for me is that we need some help here. And so we endeavored to provide that help to them through the Emergencies Act.
Okay, I'm at the end of my
Mr. Commissioner,
time.
I just wanted to clarify, because I think the impression was left inadvertently or otherwise that these are the minister's texts as opposed to the Chief of Staff,
I'm
Jones.
sorry. You're right.
And I apologize for intervening.
No, thank you. That's helpful. Mr. Commissioner, I'm at the end, but if I can ask for 5 minutes to ask some concluding questions.
Oh, it's your call when you still have time, so.
Not a lot. Oh, actually, no, I do have some
By
time.
my
Okay.
count, you have lots of time. but
Actually, you
I
can,
was
you
just
can count
thinking
better than
about-
I am, better than I can. I was thinking of the old time allocation. Okay,
So-
so,
Something rarely heard in any kind of a proceeding.
No, well, I have a lot of experience following time. Or not following it. So it's just wondering if you wanted the break now or later. That's
sure,
up
let's
to you.
take the break now. Let's take the break now.
Sir, before we take the break, I just have a quick application. I apologize, sir. I think it's important. I've just met Mr. Alexander Cohen. He's present in this room. And sir, Mr. Cohen, as we have heard throughout this proceeding, has relevant and material evidence to this proceeding's mandate. He has very relevant evidence with respect to the inquiry as to the circumstances, as to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. He also has relevant and material information with respect to misinformation, of which this commission has been tasked with exploring, beginning with the text messages between himself and Mary Liz Power that are already in evidence in building the narrative with respect to the protesters in Ottawa being extremists and thereafter essentially setting out that they are, in fact, proprietors of Nazi symbolism. Sir, this commission has been hearing from various.
I mean, can I just interrupt?
Yeah.
What's your application?
I'd like to call him as a witness, sir.
Well, have you written any, is there
I didn't expect that we would have the opportunity.
well, you haven't at the moment. There's
well-
no application, so.
Well, this is my application, sir. I'm making it orally, and I'm asking for the commission to have him testify after the minister. He has relevant material information.
I'm not going to do this orally right now.
Well, sir,
I-
we're given 15 minutes to cross-examine, to
That-
elicit relevant and material evidence. And we have relevant and material witnesses here. The government of Canada has redacted without lawful authority all of these statements from these staffers and have suppressed records.
I
We
have no
one here, sir.
idea at this point where this is going, so I'm going to take the break. And if you can speak to Commission Counsel, which I think I've repeated many times, is the way to at least raise the issue.
Yes.
And then we'll see if they can resolve it or
Yes.
not. But we have a schedule, and
Sir, the
This is the
schedule is not
problem.
as important at getting to the
so
truth.
there's no question we want to get at the truth. But you know what? It's a very complex issue, and it's not all about what you want. It's about what the commission needs to do, what the
Yes, sir,
parties
and I-
want to do.
and I think it's what
I'm
Canadians
trying-
are entitled to, sir.
I'm trying to control a process. And we have witnesses, we have a schedule. It's been going for a while. Please speak to Commission Counsel. We'll see where we go, and we'll take the morning break.
Sir, I understand, but I just asked for a ruling after the morning break. Thank you.
So we'll take 15 minutes.
La commission is in recess for 15 minutes et la commission est levée pour 15 minutes. Order à l'ordre. The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Sir,
Okay, the Commission Counsel has not completed her
I understand,
presentation.
but sir, and your counsel's advised you that,
No,
I know you've
I'm
directed, you
sorry-
wanted the
I'm sorry,
application.
I'm speaking.
Yes, sir.
The application, if you want to do it, you've been advised it's to be done in writing, not in the middle of the
Sir, we
presentation.
filed 2 motions in
So
writing at your
I'm
direction that
sorry.
you've refused to rule on with respect to the redaction
you're-
of documents from the government of Canada.
You're
That
speaking,
has
I'm
not been
speaking.
ruled on, and they've been
Okay.
filed for days.
I will take a break while you're asked to
Sir?
leave. I will return in 5 minutes if security could deal with the council.
The commission is in recess. La commission est levée. Order à l'ordre.
No need to stand. I'm not a judge here. I'm just a commissioner.
The commission is reconvened. La commission reprend.
Okay. Thank you, Commission Counsel.
Welcome back, Minister. I want to take you back to something you touched on before the break, and I'd like to get your reaction on. I asked you whether, if you had seen and absorbed, let's put it that way, Commissioner Lucky's statement that they had not yet exhausted all available tools. Law enforcement still had tools available. I asked you whether that would have changed your mind as to the necessity of the Emergencies Act, and you answered no, and you explained that your concern about Coots. How do you reconcile that position with the notion that the Emergencies Act is a measure of last resort?
Well, first I would say that the absence of having a direct conversation with Commissioner Lucky, and I pointed out the call that we had earlier today, but that wasn't the only one. There were other meetings at ERGs and daily briefings. Really was an impediment at that point to have the kind of back and forth exploration of that advice, which she had included in an email to my Chief of Staff, Mike Jones. I think the other thing, the other reason why I don't believe it would have substantially changed my views at that point are twofold. One, it didn't really expand at all on how she had come to that point of view. So when she talked about a plan, there was no elaboration on it. And I would point out that for the better part of the 2 weeks leading up to to February 13th, that there were times where the commissioner and others at those daily calls that we were having were expressing concerns about the absence of a plan with existing authorities. So at that particular moment in time, it seemed to me as a conclusory statement that was not substantiated with any kind of particular detail. And the second reason why I don't believe it would have changed, where my thinking was at that particular moment in time was predominantly because of the call earlier that day, which was top of mind. And as I explained before the morning break, I beg your pardon, it spoke volumes about what her state of mind was, which was that this was potentially an escalation of violence that could result in there being gun violence and potentially serious injuries or even fatalities to members of law enforcement and Canadians. One thing I didn't mention was that my worry, my real fear, was that had that operation not gone down peacefully, that it might have sparked other gun violence across the country. And I recall early reports from the Ottawa Police Service that guns had been brought into the National Capital Region and into the potentially into the parliamentary precinct. And there wasn't a lot of detail around that, I want to be clear, but we were operating with the best information that we had available to us. So that elevated my concerns. And so that was where my state of mind was, as opposed to the one bullet point that she had sent to my chief of staff shortly before the cabinet meeting on February 13th.
Okay, so you're expressing here a concern that what was going on in Coots might be going on in other places. Not evidence of that, but you were nevertheless concerned about it.
On the basis of both previous information and reports publicly available from Ottawa Police Service that firearms had made their way into the capital, and as well, again, a report about an arrest involving someone who was participating in the convoy here that ultimately resulted in the seizure of a firearm. So I was worried about the potential chain reaction, that if the operation did not go flawlessly, that it might actually escalate in more violence. And that's why I think she communicated that, very clearly, and rightfully so. I want to be clear that Commissioner Lucky was entirely appropriate and justified in signaling that this was a, potentially much higher level of concern around the state of affairs.
Okay, so I'll put this to you, and you can tell me right or wrong. But are you sort of saying your concern was okay, but what if it gets worse?
My concern was that this information was highly sensitive. It involved a hardened cell. It involved guns. It involved ideological symbolism potentially. And that if that operation to arrest those individuals did not go efficiently and smoothly and peacefully, that it may have created a chain reaction elsewhere across the country, because there were past reports about the presence of guns.
Okay, so I should have put my question more clearly maybe, but with respect to the availability of tools and whether law enforcement had what it needed, are you saying, and you may not be, so I'm asking you, but are you saying that regardless of whether there may have been tools available, there was a concern that it would actually, that the situation would get worse?
Yes, and again, the urgency with which we had that conversation, the confidentiality around it, the operational sensitivity about it, the jeopardy of having lives at stake, the potential chain reaction of other gun violence across the country on the basis of reports, and the concurrent advice that we were getting about tools that could only be granted in the Emergencies Act because resources were ineffective at restoring public safety, and there were gaps around deploying RCMP efficiently. I mean, you'll recall the swearing-in provisions, the no-go zones, the procuring of tow trucks, all of that was where my state of mind was.
Okay.
And by the way, those were conversations that we did have in person at the ERGs and at the cabinet table around where those gaps were.
Where the gaps were.
Yes.
So we have heard evidence about gaps that have been that were identified. We also heard from a number of officials, and we saw in documentation a lot of hesitancy around the idea of using the Emergencies Act and the possibility that it may inflame tensions, it may make things worse. There was a lot of, if I could put it this way, doubt around that. In light of that, and in light also of a lot of discussion that we've had here in the commission about whether the threshold itself was met under the Emergencies Act, can you go there at this point and explain to us your understanding of why the threshold was met and why it was necessary in light of the hesitancy that had been expressed about the need to invoke it?
Well, you've touched on a few important points in your question, so I'm going to try and unpack the questions that you put to me. Just first on hesitancy, I would be more inclined to describe it as reluctance, and I think that instinct was the right one. That this was a statute that was created coming out of the aftermath of the October 1970 crisis, and there being real concerns about resorting to the War Measures Act and using the military to restore public order, which is not the mandate or the expertise of the military, a very blunt instrument. And the creation of the Emergencies Act, which very consciously and deliberately does not make any reference to military powers, but nevertheless affords the government broad scope to respond to public order emergencies. And just by virtue of its title, if you're into an emergency, this is obviously a very serious situation. So you don't want to have to use it unless it's necessary. So that is the right posture, I think, of every government, that this is not a piece of legislation that we should be using in a way that is anything reserved but for the most serious situations. So that's my answer in regards to the reluctance around it. You also mentioned in your question that this business about there being the concern that if we invoke the Emergencies Act, that it might actually lead to more violence or radicalization, as I believe you heard from Mr. Vigneault and CSIS. I was very mindful of that, but I also, and colleagues at the cabinet table, also had to weigh the risks of not invoking the Emergencies Act because there were the materialization of counter-protests from individuals, specifically in Ottawa, because they were so frustrated at their inability to go to their jobs, take their kids to daycare, get access to emergency medical services, their prescriptions and the like. I mean, it was utter and total mayhem. I mean, let's call a spade a spade. And so that frustration was boiling over. And my concern, in my capacity as the Minister for Public Safety, is that if we don't equip police with the additional tools and the authorities that they need to specifically address the gaps that they had been consistently briefing us on, then that might lead to more violence. And so we also had to weigh the risks of not taking the decision to invoke. And so that we weighed in the potential concerns around radicalization, but ultimately we came down on the side of invoking. Okay.
On this point then, Mr. Clerk, can you pull up ssm.nsc.can 50290? Excuse me. So this is a readout of minutes of the guns and gangs. Can you situate us actually, Mr. Mendeccino, and tell us guns and gangs, what does that refer to, that meeting?
Sorry, this is a document published by?
It's a reading or minutes of a meeting that was held. The date, Alex? It's not clear. Okay, the date of it isn't clear actually, but we know that it's post-invocation. because it refers to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. And it says schedule was changed, guns and gangs instead. It's a guns and gangs meeting. And there's a report from you, M3, I think refers to you. That's a notation that's often used to describe you, M3. Why M3?
Minister Marco Mendeccino.
I should have been able to answer that. Okay. Bullet number 3 here. You're discussing, okay, well, let's go from the bullet number 1, update on current state of affairs. The blockades that started a month ago aiming critical infrastructure had a very significant and negative impact on our security, sovereignty, and integrity at the borders. We worked very closely with FPT to get a grasp of the risks to public safety and international security. The important one, which I'll slow down on, is the third one. We took unprecedented decision to invoke Emergencies Act on the advice we received from many branches of enforcement on every level.
Right.
What I want to ask you about here is the advice you received from branches of enforcement. Was that advice to invoke the Emergencies Act specifically?
The advice that we received was around tools that could only be granted through the Emergencies Act. And the reason why I say that is that there's an express element of the test that says that you don't get to the threshold unless you've exhausted authorities, or unless it can be established that existing authorities are ineffective at restoring public safety. And for me, that is the operative word, because there were authorities that were on the books. But the fact is that on the basis of what I was seeing and what I was hearing, that those existing authorities were not sufficiently effective to restore public safety. And that is consistent with the advice that we were getting from various partners within the public safety community, including law enforcement, including CBSA, and other officials, as you've heard.
Okay, so just to recap then, the advice you're talking about is the advice that's identifying gaps in tools, not specifically advice to invoke the Emergencies Act, but advice that goes to identifying gaps or tools. And
tools, as you actually saw in the email from Commissioner Lucky on February 13th, that would be invoked in the Emergencies Act. She used that language in her email to me.
Okay. Then the very last question, I think I actually am now out of time. So the last question I want to ask you, Minister Mendeccino, and your legal background shows and how you unpacked my triple-barreled question last time around. So this is the last barrel, the third barrel that you didn't get to in your answer, which is the threshold for invoking a public order emergency, as you know, depends on identifying a threat to the security of Canada with reference to the CSIS Act. We've heard a lot of discussion at the Commission about how that threshold may or may not have been met, and we know that there was no specific threat to the security of Canada assessed by CSIS. Nevertheless, the government concluded that the threshold was met, presumably because the Act was invoked. How, in your view, was that threshold met?
Well, first, let me address the piece about CSIS's conclusion, and I know you've heard some evidence about that. But I do think it is important to emphasize that they are assessing through their mandate, which is conventionally confined to espionage and foreign interference and potential threats to cybersecurity for the purposes of establishing a legal threshold under that statute, which then leads to potentially obtaining warrants judicially authorized so that we can mitigate against those potential security threats. This was very different. This was not about isolating a lone wolf or a small group. Rather, it was about looking at a protest which became illegal at a national scale and completing that exercise also had to take a look at the broader objective and scope of the Emergencies Act, which means looking at Section 2 of that statute, where it talks about the presence of a serious threat or a threat of serious violence so as to exceed the capacity of any province to respond on the basis of authorities that exist. And so in my judgment, you need to kind of look at both. And that was precisely the skill set that I was applying in my role as Minister of Public Safety, drawing on my understanding of the law and the principles as they were being applied to the facts that existed on the ground at the time. And so looking at everything in its totality, we had a situation where for 2 weeks, we had a protest that was national in scale that overwhelmed the resources of police and other border officials very deliberately for a protracted period of time, where despite the existence of statutes and resources, and in my view, as informed by counter-operational tactics that were specifically deployed to stop people from restoring public safety, the extraordinary jeopardy that it placed our economy in, the thousands of Canadians who had their jobs interrupted, the fact that businesses were shuttered, that sectors were compromised, that are the literal and figurative engine of our economy, the fact that all of this was tied to a politically stated objective to overthrow the government if it refused to reverse course on pandemic policy, and the challenges that were presented to the security and intelligence community and the broader law enforcement community in understanding what the nature of this protest was and why it was so difficult and challenging to restore public safety, all drew me to the conclusion that we met the threshold. And ultimately, for me, at the end of the day, it worked. I'm not saying that the Emergencies Act is a perfect instrument, and my sincere hope to the Commission is that there will be some reflection about that. But it was a measure that was successfully deployed by law enforcement to restore public safety without significant injury or any fatalities at all. And the fact that as part of the invocation of this act, that we now have an opportunity to go over the circumstances that led to that decision in great forensic detail, with witnesses testifying, is, I think, an important pillar of our democratic process, which, of course, was one of the things that we were very much concerned with preserving throughout. So I mean, that is my answer with regards to the threshold and why I think it's important that I'm here today.
Mr. Commissioner, those are my questions. I'll pass the baton.
Okay. So now cross-examination, start with the convoy organizers, please.
Good morning. Good morning, sir. My name is Keith Wilson, counsel for the convoy organizers. I apologize for my voice. I'm recovering from a cold.
I have a bit of the same.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we're not in a position to proceed with cross at this time, and there's two reasons. One is the federal government has disclosed over a week ago an extensive volume of documents that are highly redacted. It is obvious from the face of the documents that they don't meet the criteria for lawful redactions. A motion was made last week for those redactions to be lifted. The submissions closed on Thursday evening. We still have no ruling. A number of days have passed. For the cross-examination and the discovery of truth process to be valid and effective, the parties require access to the documents. We don't have that. So we would appreciate some indication as to when the Commission is actually going to rule on that and hopefully compel the proper disclosure of the records so that cross-examinations can be effective. I emphasize that these documents are not related to future witnesses, but present witnesses. So we're making the process inefficient, with all due respect, by not allowing the parties to have access to unredacted documents. Second reason we're not in a position to proceed with our cross-examination at this time with this witness is our lead counsel, Mr. Brendan Miller, who had prepared for the cross, as you know, sir, has been removed from the room by you when he was raising a motion to find a way around the absence of a ruling on the redactions. So we're just not in a position to proceed on cross, sir.
Okay, well, just on your first question, it is expected that the ruling will come out at during the lunch hour. There have been fair amount of back and forth. Without going into detail, there's some, let's say, innovative type of issues that had to be dealt with. So that should come out at the lunchtime, which I'm happy to, yeah, I will do my utmost. It's going to come out, unfortunately, probably in not on the record, the website, because it won't be translated, which is one of the issues we have to deal with. But we will, in light of what you say, we'll issue it in English only for the moment, and it will be posted when it's bilingual. But I understand that submission. So that should enable you, so we can put off the cross-examinations till after the lunchtime. In terms of the other problem, that's not something I can deal with. I'm trying to deal the best I can with the situation. And quite frankly, if the issue had been raised the way you have now, I would have given the answer I'm giving now. So what I propose then, since this witness will be here after lunch, we simply delay till after lunch. If you could endeavor, because I see you have, Mr. Will, you have a co-counsel, so can sort out how that can be done, that would be appreciated.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, so the next I'll call on the OPP, please.
Timer here. Good afternoon, Minister. Chris Diana, Counsel to the OPP.
Good afternoon.
We received some documents last night that we're all frantically trying to review. Some of them are quite interesting. And one of the ones I'd like to start with, Mr. Clerk, is PB.CAN.401849. And this appears to be a text exchange with you and an unidentified person who I'm hoping you'll be able to help us identify. And if we can go to page 26. All right, so if you could help situate us as to kind of context here. This appears to be a text with someone, I believe you're on the left and somebody else is on the right. If you could scroll down a little bit so that the witness has a chance to review it. Do you know who this text exchange was with?
I believe it's Mike Jones.
And he would be your chief of staff, correct?
Yes.
And someone who you would have been in touch with, obviously, every day, that your closest contact within your system. All right, and so if we scroll to the top again to set the time context here, Monday, February 14th at 12:48 a.m. So very early in the morning, February 14th. So basically the night of February 13th, if we were to look at it that way. And the context here is that the Ambassador Bridge had just been opened to traffic, I believe about 30 minutes earlier. Is that correct?
Yes.
That accords with your recollection of when this text exchange took place?
It does. There were some questions about whether or not it was fully opened and exactly when CBSA would declare that it was officially open. But on the whole, yes, there were reports that it was opened in the early hours of February the 14th.
Yeah, so I think for clarity, I think the Windsor Police Service institutional report identifies 12:12 a.m. on that day. So
that sounds about right to me.
All right, and so you would agree that everything you had heard was that while it was open, there was still a concern about potential volatility, correct?
That's right.
All right, if we can...
There were reports of flare-ups, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
Either on the 13th, but certainly after the 14th as well.
All right, so I'm interested in the text that says, and I'll read it, following the declaration, we should go to Ambassador and inspect the bridge reopening and thank law enforcement and RCMP, assuming things go according to plan. So I'd like to follow up on what, and this is you texting Mike Jones, correct?
Yes.
Your term following the declaration, I assume you're talking about the Emergencies Act declaration?
Yes.
And you would agree the Emergencies Act had not yet been invoked at this point, correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, there had not even been consultation with the provinces at this point, correct?
That's, well, to be clear, the first minister's meeting had not yet occurred, which occurred the next morning. There were conversations with provincial and territorial counterparts, but it was before the first minister's meeting.
Right, but I think and I'm not going to go to the document for lack of time, but I think it was made very clear by the Prime Minister and others that that his mind hadn't been made up yet, that the consultation was essentially being done in good faith.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes, and I wasn't communicating that the decision had been finally taken, but rather the assumption that it may have been.
Not may have been. Following the declaration, it sounds to me like you're pretty convinced that it was going to be made, regardless of what happened at the consultation.
I won't dispute we were definitely trending very much in that direction, yes.
Okay. Assuming things go according to plan. And so what plan are you referring to here?
Restoring public safety. And Ambassador Bridge was one of the real flashpoints, as you'll recall, because not only of the impact domestically in Windsor, but Ambassador Bridge was one of the reasons why I was engaged by my American counterpart, Secretary Mayorkas, who had reached out and was very concerned that it was going to have an impact on two-way trade. And you will be familiar with this by now, I assume, but at Ambassador Bridge, we do the most significant amount of our day-to-day land trade. So there was a lot at stake in restoring public safety at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Detroit.
Right. So a cynic might suggest, and we're both lawyers, and there are a number of us in that category. A cynic might suggest that it appears here you're talking about setting up a photo op in Windsor even before the Emergencies Act is invoked.
I agree with you. A cynic may suggest that, but that was not my my intent. The point was, this was a very stressful time, and I wanted to be in a position to reassure Canadians that we were restoring public safety right across the country, including in Windsor, Detroit, and that was an idea that I had proposed at the time to my chief of staff.
Okay, so let's read the rest of it. Your chief of staff says, okay, do you know when that will be? Presumably being the invocation of the act, correct?
Yes.
Your response, I'm hearing as late as tomorrow morning. I think it's a powerful visual. Otherwise, it's just tweets. So basically what you're saying is I should go there, get some pictures, get some video, because it sends a better image than just tweeting about it. Fair?
Well, I think what I'm getting at is that people are anxious and are concerned and want to be confident that we are restoring public safety. I mean, I would point out that that is not the end of the matter, and there's some additional back and forth between my chief of staff and law enforcement. Ultimately, I chose not to go on sober reflection.
All right, so let's go to that then. The OPP was not impressed with this idea. Is that fair to say?
I didn't speak directly with the OPP, but it was expressed to me that law enforcement had concerns about me or any other elected official going.
All right, if we can take up the document ID OPP 4582. And I'm going to be taking you to text messages between Commissioner Carrique and Deputy Commissioner Chris Harkins on February 14th. And once that's up, if we can go to page 71. And that they were concerned, of course, and I think you heard this from the RCMP as well, was the potential that it could further inflame the situation if you actually showed up and took pictures. Fair?
And I had to balance that against what my initial thought or objective was, which was to be accessible and to assure people that we had restored public safety. So in the end, I took that very much into consideration and was actually quite deferential and respectful to the advice that we got back from police and chose not to go.
Okay, can we go back to the other document, which is pb.can.1849? And this is back to your text exchange with Mike Jones. And page 32. Here it says RCMP, and this is, I believe, Mike Jones saying, RCMP Commissioner also strongly advising against a trip to Windsor. Concerned that it's still quite volatile and things have been inflamed by today's announcement, someone drove at an officer again. I want the visual as well, but with 2 levels of forces asking us not to, my 2 cents is that it's not worth the risk of going and something happening in response. Delaying gives us more time to plan, etc. Let's discuss. So essentially, it was your chief of staff that was saying, look, we've heard from 2 police services. Let's not do this.
Yeah, solid advice, and I took it.
In retrospect, and I raise this because, I think you would agree that sometimes having politicians attend these kinds of sites can have perhaps unintended consequences. Fair?
Absolutely, yes.
And that in retrospect, you would agree that it probably wasn't a good idea to have gone.
Yes, that's why we didn't go. Yes.
And in my last minute, I'm going to ask you about consultation. And I've put these questions to other witnesses, but I'm just simply going to ask you or put to you the proposition about consultation with law enforcement. And the suggestion that I'll put to you is that it's a good idea that when there is consultation with law enforcement on tools, that be done in writing for purposes of accountability so we can go back and check exactly who said what to whom.
Right.
Would you agree that's a good idea?
Totally, and you would have heard my evidence a little bit earlier this morning where I talked about navigating the principle of operational independence. I referred to Article 9.3 under police service agreements, which we reach with provinces, which actually do set out a mechanism and a protocol by which additional resources are requested from the Office of the Federal Minister of Public Safety, as well as the Office of the Provincial Ministers of Public Safety. One thing I didn't mention, but I do think is really relevant, is that in those police service agreements, it is expressly contemplated under either 9.1 or 9.2 of those agreements that prior to the deployment of intra-provincial RCMP resources, it is the elected provincial minister of public safety who has to form the opinion that there is a state of emergency before they can be deployed. And it is only if existing RCMP resources within the province are overwhelmed or insufficient to deal with that emergency that you then take the next step of requesting for the deployment of RCMP resources outside of the province to deal with the situation, which is Article 9.3. And that is a request that comes to this office. My point is, I agree with you that there is a protocol there. The Emergencies Act, unfortunately, does not prescribe that process. So what we did instead was we did the best that we could, having various meetings daily, ultimately in the ERG and the cabinet meetings where we were soliciting inputs, including, as you saw in the email that I received from Commissioner Lucky the day before, where she very specifically and thoughtfully prescribes tools that could only be granted under the Emergencies Act. But I agree that maybe some additional thought ought to be given to this protocol.
Right, and I am out of time, so as I'm leaving, I'm just going to say that we've heard evidence, that some ambiguous evidence about conversations within the RCMP, perhaps with others, that haven't been written down. And I think you would agree that it would be helpful to have everything clear and unambiguous so there's no room for doubt.
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you.
Okay, next call on the Ottawa Police Service, please.
Good afternoon, Minister. My name is Jessica Barrow, and I'm one of the counsel to Ottawa Police Service.
Good afternoon.
Prior to the arrival of the convoy, would you agree with me that there was conflicting information about how many protesters may participate in Ottawa, as well as how long they may stay?
I do agree. And by the way, the range was very broad.
Right.
I mean, I'd heard something in the low thousands, and then it quickly escalated as we got closer to the weekend, upwards of 7,000 or 8,000. So yes.
And so that was a real difficulty from a planning perspective at all levels of government and law enforcement. Is that fair?
Yes.
And in fact, you testified earlier that you were concerned that even the intelligence you were receiving from your team maybe didn't fully capture all of what you were seeing in terms of public narrative. Is that fair?
I recall that, yes.
And Deputy Minister Stewart testified last week that there was a difficulty amongst the intelligence community at that time in assessing the information that was being received because much of that evidence was open source and there was difficulty ascertaining the credibility of that information. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
And so again, that's something that all levels of law enforcement would have been grappling with at that time.
I agree.
And so ultimately, no one really had a very clear picture in advance of the scope of the event as well as the behavior of the protesters before it arrived. Is that fair?
Yes, and I think you've heard from a number of individuals, including me, that posed challenges with regards to assessing the intelligence and the information about who the protest was made up of, how many would participate, how long they would stay, what would be the kind of conduct they would be engaging in, could it become violent? There was a lot of information to have to sift through and assess, and it was, as you pointed out, at times varying and conflicting, and so that definitely posed some challenges.
And ultimately, what we did see here in Ottawa, as well as elsewhere in the country, was entirely unprecedented, both in terms of the scope as well as the behavior we ultimately saw from protesters. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
I want to move on to the police response once the protesters arrived here in Ottawa. And we've heard considerable evidence to the effect that when OPS and its partners engaged in ad hoc enforcement actions or ticketing, bylaw enforcement, things like that, it could create dangerous situations for officers. We heard about swarming, harassment, I think you spoke to earlier. So you would agree that that type of thing was occurring in Ottawa, correct?
It was, and I was worried, as I said earlier, that it was the function of some counter-operational advice that was being provided to the block in the occupation, and it was, in addition to police officers, it was public figures, and we've heard many reports about serious criminal violent threats, including death threats. I received a death threat. My family received a death threat throughout the convoy. It was members of the press who were trying to report on the facts that were occurring on the ground. There were many, I think, efforts to try to crowd out legitimate law enforcement here.
Right, and so that was a real difficulty for law enforcement on the ground, particularly OPS, since that was the bulk of the officers, obviously, at that time, that to be able to engage in any real enforcement was a real challenge as a result of what they were facing in response.
Yes.
And that remained the case until they had sufficient resources, correct?
That's right.
And at that time, they did not have the sufficient resources to really engage in meaningful enforcement in a way that people could maybe see it as meaningful. Is that fair?
And I would say both Chief Slowly and then Interim Chief Bell both expressed concerns about having sufficient resources in the ground, which is why in my capacity as Minister of Public Safety, I was facilitating additional help with the assistance of the Commissioner of the RCMP by providing those resources, and when that didn't work, looking at other tools leading up to the Emergencies Act.
So specifically with respect to the resources, you would obviously agree that that messaging coming from both OPS and Chief Slowly was from the very beginning, essentially. Once it became apparent that these protesters were not leaving, it became equally apparent that there was insufficient resources. Is that fair?
That came very early on, yes.
And would it be fair to say that any concerns in relation to operational plans or the level of enforcement should not be taken as some kind of suggestion that OPS should have engaged in enforcement action without the resources they needed?
Well, that was certainly the subject of discussion that was going on between the RCMP, the OPP, and the OPS as it was reported to me. It was about making sure that we understood what the plan was and what was needed by the Ottawa Police Service to restore public safety. And from where I sat, one way in which we could support the formulation and the ultimate implementation of a plan would be to offer additional RCMP resources, and that we did.
Right, and so none of the sort of, like we could call it criticisms about the lack of enforcement or the lack of a plan should be perceived as a suggestion that that OPS should have been engaging in enforcement, notwithstanding the fact that they didn't have the resources to do that safely.
I would agree that we shouldn't be sending out any police officer into the field if they can't be safe.
Right.
And so this particular event was singular and unprecedented, as you pointed out earlier, and therefore it did require sufficient and significant resources to restore public safety.
And something you said earlier, and I just want to expand on it if I can, you indicated that it was essentially impossible to police those on Wellington Street. Do you recall making a statement to that effect?
Yes, I held that view throughout the entirety of the blockade and the occupation until we invoked the Emergencies Act.
And that's because if you compare the sort of lawlessness of the behavior of the protesters as compared to the resources that were there to deal with that situation, there was a disconnect. Is that fair?
It was disproportionately skewed towards those who were participating in the occupation, and I believe at times that was a tactical decision. And when police tried to enforce, they were crowded out, they were swarmed, they were intimidated in some cases, reports of assaults. So yes, they were overwhelmed.
And so when we talk about the operational plans, and you've touched on it a couple of times, would it be fair to say that the reason the plans were required was to ensure that if the resources were provided, there was an understanding by those agencies about how they would be used to safely and productively contribute to an end of the event?
Yes.
And so it wasn't a question of undermining the actions of OPS. It was about ensuring collaboration. Is that fair?
Yes.
And there was never any suggestion that OPS should have engaged in an overall operation to end the event before it had the resources to do that safely.
I think that makes sense.
Okay. I want to move on and quickly discuss a couple of points referenced in your witness statement in relation to the engagement proposal. I don't think I need to bring up your witness statement, but I'm happy to if that's necessary. Deputy Minister Stewart testified that the purpose of the draft engagement proposal was to give protesters in Ottawa a potential exit strategy. Do you agree with that statement?
To the best of my recollection, yes, that sounds right.
And that view came from Deputy Minister Stewart's conversations with Inspector Bowden, who you may or may not know is an expert from OPP on protester engagement through his PLT work. Are you aware of that?
Yes, I have some recollection of that.
And he also testified, he being Deputy Minister Stewart, that the proposal had buy-in from both OPP and OPS. Were you aware of that?
I believe so, yes.
And you testified earlier that you saw it to be your job during this time, or perhaps the job of your department, to ensure that law enforcement had both the resources and the tools they required.
That's correct.
And so in your witness statement, you indicated that there were two issues with respect to why the engagement proposal didn't come to fruition. The first was questions that were left unanswered about the convoy organizers, who they are and who was in charge. And the second related to safety concerns about the person engaged in the proposal. Do you recall saying that?
Yes, and in addition to that, the logistics of where engagement would occur.
Okay, so I just want to pull up a couple documents in relation to that. The first is OTT 405318. If we could scroll to the bottom. So this is an email, sorry, up a little so we can see who it's to yet. Sorry, the email at the bottom of the first page. Yes, there. So this is an email from someone at Ottawa Police named Vicki Nelson to a number of people, including Deputy Minister Stewart. And as you can see, it says, "Good morning on behalf of General Counsel. Please find attached the list of the convoy leaders and their affiliates." That's on February 7th. And then if you scroll to the top, it's an email back from Mr. Stewart saying thank you. And so you would agree with me that there is some level of engagement with OPS to get the information your department needs about those convoy organizers and their affiliates to assist with this proposal.
It would appear so on the basis of that email exchange. I don't recall being briefed at the time about who those individuals were, or moreover, how those individuals would help to ensure the clearing of the convoy. But yes, on what you're showing me, it does seem that there is a back and forth between Deputy Minister Stewart and the Ottawa Police Service on who the leaders of the organization might be.
Thank you. I'm just going to bring up one last document. This one's pb.nsc.can 2963. If we go to the second page, right there, we see the first bullet. Would the signatory of the letter or the person who goes to the meeting be putting themselves at risk? Is that a big concern? And this is an email exchange between yourself and Mr. Stewart, amongst various other people. Does this reflect the concern that you're referencing in relation to whether there would be a risk to the person engaging with this proposal?
Sorry, can we just go back up to the top of that document from Rob to, right, sorry. Scroll down a bit. And again. So the way I recall this is that the Deputy Minister Stewart is responding to concerns that I had raised with him about the engagement proposal.
Right. So if we scroll then to the back up to the first page of the document, it looks like we have the answers to those questions. And if we look at the last or the second bullet, we see the risk to the signatory and government rep at a later date meeting is low, assuming the meeting is virtual. So again, would you agree that the concern that you've raised has been addressed as a result of a conversation between Deputy Minister Stewart and his OPP expert?
I would say it begun to address the concerns. I don't think I was wholly satisfied by the answers that I had gotten at that stage. In particular, I would have explored the assessment that the risk to the signatory and to the government rep was low, because I needed to understand exactly where the setup was going to be, how it was going to be undertaken, and bearing in mind at the time the situation on the ground was volatile and at times extremely chaotic, and certainly with a very compromised ability to enforce the law. I really wanted to be satisfied that those answers, that those questions would be answered, because if I went back to Cabinet and was asked about the engagement proposal that was being worked up by my deputy minister, I had to be accountable and I had to be in a position to answer them. So it begun to answer some of those questions, I would say, not completely.
So you said I would have, as though it were hypothetical. Did you ultimately continue that conversation, or was the decision made at this point to kind of stop the process?
No, there was no decision to stop the process. And there were some ongoing conversations about engagement. And, ultimately, this is February 12th, 12/25. The following day, we have an ERG and then a cabinet meeting. And then the 14th is the day in which, it's about a day and a half after this email exchange, we saw that the efforts of the City of Ottawa were not successful in the engagement proposal. And by then we were into the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
So you would say sort of events overtook and the proposal fell by the wayside?
I would say there was a lot of work that was going on, and I know that the Deputy Minister at the time was working very hard to fulfill this task around the engagement proposal, but we were also, meeting with enforcement officials, meeting with Cabinet, meeting with and engaging with provincial and territorial colleagues. And then, yes, the sequence of events that had to be fulfilled prior to taking a decision on the invocation of the Emergencies Act was pressing.
Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Counsel for former Chief Slowly, please.
Thank you. Minister, Tom Curry for the former chief.
Good afternoon.
Just on the point that was last raised, were you briefed on the outcome of the effort to try to engage protesters in Windsor by Minister Jones or by the OPP and the letter from Minister Jones?
I recall some information coming to me about that engagement and it being similarly unsuccessful. I recall there being a report about a letter being circulated to individuals who were part of the blockade in Windsor, and that my recollection is that it did not gain any traction with them. And so likewise, here in Ottawa, a lot of the concerns around the cohesive structure of the blockade and the occupation raised legitimate concerns about whether or not, even if a negotiated settlement had been reached, whether or not it would have been successful in disengaging and clearing the blockade and the occupation.
Thank you. The issue about whether a negotiated resolution was possible, was that taken eventually to cabinet and discussed?
It was discussed at definitely one of the ERGs where, as I said earlier today, my deputy at the time had briefed the members of the ERG on the constitution of the individuals that made up the occupation here in Ottawa and the degree to which they were entrenched and dug in, and how we might shaken or loosen that through engagement. So it was discussed, yes.
And similarly, did you become aware that the mayor of Ottawa had negotiated successfully for the relocation of some of the vehicles away from residential neighborhoods, and that was thought to represent a possible breakthrough?
I do recall there being discussions between Mayor Watson and I think his, there was an appointed a mediator that he had managed to secure. But I also remember being very concerned that the vehicles that were clearing out of neighborhoods were actually coming back downtown into the parliamentary precinct, and that created a surge of vehicles that were, again, entrenching at the seat of the federal government. And my concern was that it was actually growing the scale of the occupation here, and that would have made it even potentially more difficult and challenging to clear.
Right. A couple of things, if I could, just about the resources. The information that you received about resources came principally from Commissioner Luckey.
That's correct, yes.
And did you become aware that the information that you were receiving from the commissioner did not accord with the provision of resources to the OPS?
Yes, in trilateral meetings with Mayor Watson and in discussions with some of his officials, I think he articulated a concern that perhaps there was a need to look more carefully at the number of RCMP that were actually deployed, and two, what their taskings were. And I know that he sort of underlined that latter part on a couple of occasions, that it wasn't just the numbers, it was what were the RCMP going to be dispatched to do. And in fairness, those were questions that we did put to Commissioner Luckey at the time, and I think she did her best to answer them.
Right, understood. And you relied in making, I won't take you to them in the time I have, but you made various public statements in response to questions from the media about what you were doing, what the federal government was doing to help the Ottawa Police Service, and in reliance on the information you had from Commissioner Luckey, you made those statements, including naming the numbers of officers, I think at one time 250 or 275, something
in that
like
range.
that.
Yeah, the reason why we were trying to get the message out was that there were, I think, increasing questions and concerns from the city that they didn't have enough personnel, and I wanted to communicate that on behalf of the federal government that we were acting quickly and decisively to respond to those concerns by dispatching RCMP personnel.
And the idea that all you can do in your position, I presume, is rely on those in this case, the commissioner, to provide you with information to the best of her ability, and then you can rely on that and convey it. As it turns out, in this case, you learned that the information that you had and conveyed was not accurate.
Well, I would say a couple things. One, when the commissioner is briefing me, I take that information, specifically around operations, very much into account as we're making decisions about what additional resources we can offer. I was nevertheless interested to know whether or not we needed to do more to coordinate, because the mayor and certain officials were saying it wasn't just about numbers, it was about tasking. So there was a free-flowing dialogue there. The numbers was the issue of whether or not to be public about the numbers was also a concern, because the commissioner said that she was concerned that if we posted numbers or we published numbers, that might actually lead to a surge. And so we had to try to find a balance.
Right. Just for I'm not going to take it up, but in one of the statements that you made, it's captured at OPS 8365 at page 5. That's just for the record. I don't need it, Mr. Registrar. You described, again, based on information that you had from the commissioner, that the RCMP had added 275 Mounties in the Ottawa deployment. And as you pointed out, we learned later, and the commissioner and the deputy commissioner, I think, described it essentially as a mix-up about the numbers, that it wasn't actually that many Mounties. It was a way of accounting for them that added up shifts and the like. Did you subsequently become aware that that's how the numbers became, as they said, mixed up?
I was aware that there was an ongoing conversation between the RCMP and the OPS about exactly how many RCMP had been deployed to respond to the occupation and the blockade. I will say, ultimately, in the lead up to the invocation, my recollection is we did dispatch about 1,000 RCMP officers.
Yeah, in the end, it was a massive deployment, which gets to the point you've already touched on. Chief Slowly has described this as unprecedented and representing a paradigm shift in the way we think about policing public protest. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And in terms of the circumstances in which every one of you found yourselves in, all of the participants, and I include the convoy organizers who seem not also to have appreciated how many people were going to attend and maybe the nature of their sense of protest. This resulted in great frustration at all levels, as you've expressed. You were frustrated about the pace at which this was being resolved. Fair?
I was concerned about the fact that for 2 weeks we could not enforce the law and maintain public safety in the capital and at border communities across the country. Yes.
And in your communications, in the communications of some of your ministerial colleagues, do you agree that in hindsight, some of the language that was used, even internally, was unhelpful to the cause because it added concerns and doubt about the effectiveness of, for example, the Ottawa Police Service or the chief in being able to deal with the problem that had overwhelmed their service?
I think with the benefit of reflection, you always look back and ask yourself, could you have expressed a sentiment with more diplomacy? I mean, we've heard earlier today that there were some rather tense and terse exchanges. I think it is completely understandable in the moment. And it wasn't just government and police who were concerned and frustrated. The people that I was most worried about were Canadians. And the materialization of counter protests and just the ability to be able to go about daily lives was my paramount concern. And the only way we could get life back to normal is if we could uphold the law.
Right. And although you were expressing, and Minister Blair expressed, I think yesterday, and no doubt this has appeared in media because it was found in some of the documents, that he expressed his embarrassment about his former profession of law enforcement because of these circumstances. We should not take any of those comments as reflecting on the hard work that was done by the OPS or Chief Slowly at the time.
No, and I know how much regard Minister Blair holds for law enforcement. I mean, he was a member of that community for decades. So, look, it is a really tough moment for the country. It was a tough moment for the people who were impacted by the occupation. And at times, yes, emotions were definitely running high, and it was challenging. But ultimately, we got the right players at the table to restore public safety.
Can I just ask then one last thing, get your help with this, please, Minister? The issue that you've been asked about in terms of the difference between setting priorities in your role as Minister of Public Safety and interfering with operations. Do you agree with me that describing for the Commissioner the importance of, for example, the circumstances that the country found itself in with border blockades, having that discussion with the Commissioner doesn't interfere with operational autonomy?
No, I don't think so. And I think, again, this is an area that is really important to this inquiry, which is to understand where those boundaries are within the context of an emergency. So it is important that in my job as the Minister of Public Safety, that I am holding the RCMP and other line agencies in the public safety portfolio accountable for doing the job of finding ways to restore public safety, exhausting every effort, using statutory authorities which exist, using authorities and resources that exist, and failing that, to look and scan at what's left. And so that is what took us to the Emergencies Act. But throughout, finding that, that right balance of ensuring accountability without crossing the boundary is an extremely important part of this exercise. I agree with that.
At the level both of the federal and provincial ministry, because the Commissioner has seen expressions of priorities by the provincial and federal government as to, for example, the blockade at the Ambassador Bridge. That's appropriate in your judgment? Yeah, that's right. And, I do think that there are some existing conventions that we can look to have an important conversation about what those principles are. And I mentioned one under the Police Services Agreement, where there is the relationship between the elected branch of government and police when it comes to forming the opinion that an emergency exists, and then the elected government responding to requests from police to deploy resources and additional tools which may not exist in any other statute. Right. Including, the Commissioner might think about recommendations for how those priorities can be set so that, for instance, if this occurs, again, an entity or a police service like the Ottawa Police Service isn't caught between the federal and provincial government deciding which is the first port of call, for example. I think that's a very important question, because right now the linkages between municipal to provincial police services is clear through provincial statute, through the respective provincial police services acts. But there is no direct link following that to federal law enforcement resources. And that was something that we did have to navigate given the unique circumstances that we found ourselves in. And I do agree with the suggestion that was put to me earlier from Counsel for the Ontario Provincial Police, that it may be appropriate to look at developing some protocols around that. Final thing, in your dealings with Chief Slowly, do you agree that, to your observation, he performed his duties in good faith to the best of his abilities? I think Chief Slowly did the best that he could in those circumstances, yes. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Next is the Ottawa Coalition, please.
Good morning, Minister. My name is Paul Champ, and I'm counsel for the Ottawa Coalition of Residents and Businesses.
Hello.
Hi. I just have some questions for you today. I'm going to cover just two issues, the time that I have. Parliamentary staff many of them are residents of downtown Ottawa, are they not?
Yes.
And obviously their workplace was also right in the middle of this occupation as well?
Yes.
And were you hearing from parliamentary staff who were sometimes concerned about coming to work in the circumstances?
Frequently, yes.
Or were experiencing other personal impacts due to the convoy occupation?
Yes.
I wonder if I could ask the registrar to pull up a document, pb.k can.0001850. And while he's pulling that up, Minister, I just want to confirm, Mike Jones, he's your chief of staff, is that right?
That's correct.
And I gather that Mr. Jones, he was advising you of information that he received from many sources?
Yes.
Okay, so what I've pulled up here is a text messages between Mr. Jones and an Ottawa City Councillor, Matt Luloff. In blue is Mr. Jones, and in gray is Mr. Luloff. I was wondering if we could just scroll to page 2. Perfect. And here, you'll see in blue, Mr. Jones writes, so maybe not for a public avail, but heard about an incident that's pretty angering. And Mr. Luloff says, the small woman moved from blocking traffic. And then Mr. Jones writes, from one of my staff, I won't be coming into the office while convoy is there, however. My friend was directly threatened of rape yesterday because she was wearing her mask, and that is super triggering for me as a survivor of sexual assault. I know Yasser sharing how residents feel. I gather just that's probably Mr. Nakvi, the MP for downtown Ottawa. But I would be remiss if I didn't share that I don't even feel safe dropping my son off at daycare downtown, and kids have not been outside because of fear the educators will be yelled at for wearing a mask. Understood. Were you hearing those kinds of stories, Minister?
I was, and as I said, I was hearing them frequently and was very concerned about the safety of the people that were working on the Hill. I mean, I think I testified earlier that I had expressed the view that we may want to consider going completely virtual in Parliament because I was worried about the concentration of people. The fact that some of the expressions that you have pointed out today were being targeted, again, disproportionately at women. I was hearing from a lot of staff and from people on my team along the lines of these types of incidents, and that really preoccupied me. And as you may recall, I mean, there was one day on which we did actually have to shut down Parliament. I mean, that is only the second time in the history of this country where that has had to occur, and that was entirely because of security concerns. So this was very serious.
It was. If you just scroll to the next page, Mr. Chair. So we'll see understood, and then Mr. Jones says, when she reported to police, they told her, quote, well, maybe take your mask out when you're walking outside, so reduce any attention to you. And Mr. Lewis says, the city councillor of Ottawa says, yes, I've heard of these incidents too. So the were you hearing about that as well, that Ottawa police sometimes weren't following up on complaints from Ottawa residents?
Well, I don't know why, but I do know that at the time that law enforcement was overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And so my interpretation of that was just by the sheer number of incidents, and I think at one point they numbered in the thousands. Yeah. That it was difficult to investigate or take any kind of appropriate action to hold those who are responsible to account. But there were hundreds of criminal investigations and charges that were subsequently laid.
Yeah, and indeed, Minister, I'm not we've heard a lot of witnesses in this proceeding, including many Ottawa police witnesses, and the thrust of the evidence, as I heard it, was just simply capacity. They were just so overwhelmed. Right. They didn't have an opportunity. Okay, thank you. Just the second issue I wanted to speak to you about, thank you for that, is, of course, as Minister of Public Safety, the RCMP and CSIS both report to you, is that right?
Yes.
And Minister, you were receiving a range of information about the risks and threats from those agencies that were being posed by the Ottawa occupation?
Yes.
And we understand, we've heard other evidence, that there were former military and law enforcement members who were participating in and assisting the convoy. You were hearing that information?
I'd heard those reports, yes.
And I gather that was a concern for public safety because those types of individuals would have certain skills and expertise that could, present some logistical or greater threats?
Yes, that's correct.
And now, have you also heard information that former CSIS officers were participating in the protests?
I don't recall off the top of my head, but I, as you pointed out, had the concern generally about individuals who had previously served in the military and law enforcement for sure, and would really need to jig my memory about whether or not that also included members from the service.
And were you also hearing information that current members of law enforcement or military might be participating in the protests?
Well, there were reports about leaks
Indeed.
of information during operations, and involved or entailed some what appeared to be snapshots of texts, and so I do recall there being some concerns about active members being potentially sympathetic.
And are you aware, are there any investigations of those issues internally within RCMP or any of the other agencies?
I know that the RCMP certainly wanted to be sure that they were getting to the bottom of any potential security lapses, and that those investigations were conducted.
Okay. Thank you very much, Minister. Those are my questions.
Thank you.
I know I've still got some time. Maybe I'll try to roll it over to the next one.
That's to be encouraged. I may even allow that. So I think we'll take the lunch break now and come back.
Commissioner, if I may, just a couple of comments before lunch. Rob Kittredge for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. I just wanted to express regarding the removal of my friend Mr. Miller this morning. I wanted to express the Justice Center's position on asking that you make a decision about his return to the room during the lunch break, and express our support for his return to the room at the earliest convenience. I'm a big supporter of constructive communication, and I understand that may not have taken place this morning, but I think his clients have a right to representation here, and we'd like to support his ability to cross-examine Mr. Mendeccino today. If you can make that decision at lunch, that would be very much appreciated on our part.
I'm certainly a favor of communication. I believe that the convoy is still represented, so it's not a question of no representation. I'm not aware of a request that he return to the room, but if he requests it, I will consider it.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
The commission is in recess until 2 o'clock. La commission est levée jusqu'à 14 heures.